I would describe Tacoma as kind of a blue-collar town. We could go ride our bikes and walk to school without our parents fearing that something bad was going to happen to us. And I think after 1986, that changed. She was just a couple years older than me. It was on the TV every night and in the paper. And it just really shaped our childhoods, and not in a good way.
It was in the middle of a beautiful spate of weather. It had been warmer than usual, sunny, the kind of days you want to just get out and do something, either in the yard or at the beach. You want to plan a picnic. You just want to go and do.
13-year-old Jennifer Bastian and her mother Patty spend a quiet summer morning together.
Jennifer was up. I got up. I think she got cereal, I got coffee, and we just talked about the day. She was going to go on a YMCA bike riding trip. It was a trip that was a little bit timid for her. She was a petite gal riding a 15-speed bike and trying to master that before the trip. And so she was practicing every day.
And on that particular day, she asked for permission to ride her bike to the Point Defiance Park, which is something she had done before. Normally she would take a friend, but her friend was not available that day. So she went by herself, and she actually left a note for her dad, and she took off for the park.
She wrote a note saying she'd be home by 6:30. But she wasn't there for dinner. She wasn't there after she had said she would be. It gets very scary. We called a few friends, neighbors, to see if maybe Jennifer had stopped off after her ride to play with their sons or daughters. And then we called the police.
We were very close as a family. My dad, he had kids late in life, so I think he maybe appreciated being a dad even more than if he had had them as a younger man. We had a great relationship. We had great fun. I'm 2 years older. I was definitely big sister material. I was the more serious one. I was the one who followed more rules.
Jennifer was a bundle of energy. She was ready to go at a moment's notice.
She was always active, always in motion. Our dining room was kind of open to the living room. Jennifer would literally get down from the table and go into the living room and start doing cartwheels and walkovers and gymnastics moves. She was having nothing to do with the sitting still part.
Jennifer lived life.
My dad picked me up from the movies, and right when I got in the car, he said, "Jennifer hasn't come home from her bike ride yet." And his voice cracked, and I could see he had been crying, and I knew that something was very wrong.
I can't tell you what I was thinking. I can tell you I was feeling extremely anxious. The police had come. I didn't know what to expect the next would be.
The police pulled me aside. They wanted to ask me some questions. Were there things that maybe Jenny kept as a secret that she wouldn't want her mom and dad to know? Really the answer to all of that was no. We didn't have any secrets.
The police asked for a piece of her clothing or something from her room. Ralph and I both went into the bedroom. We got a t-shirt or school bag, or I don't know what it was, gave it to them. She could have fallen down, had a flat tire, go through a whole litany of things it could have been.
They brought in bloodhounds to track from Jennifer's house down to the park. The dogs picked up her scent and indicated that she had gone around the 5-mile drive based on her scent, but the dogs didn't locate her or her bike.
When there is still no sign of Jennifer the following morning, the search intensifies.
The 5-mile drive was closed down while searchers went on horseback, on ATVs, on foot. It's kind of hard for people to grasp how massive and expansive Point Defiance Park is until you've seen it. It's a forest surrounded by the sea. There are really, really steep cliffs that go straight down into the water. So there was a question of, could she have gone off a cliff and been washed out to sea? The news covered the story. There were flyers made up and posted all over the north end of Tacoma. They had about 300 plus people out looking for Jennifer, and they found nothing. The thought process after that 3-day search was, she's not in the park.
I think it was on day 2 or 3 that the doorbell rang and I answered it. And there's a lady there. And she said, "Are you Patty?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "I'd like to talk with you," and introduced herself as Barbara Welsh, Michella's mom.
12-year-old Michella Welch disappeared 5 months before Jennifer. She was last seen riding her bike near Puget Park, mere miles from where Jennifer vanished. 10 hours after Michella was reported missing, search dogs found her body. She'd been sexually assaulted and murdered. The little girl's killing shocks the community.
I know I felt sorry for her, having just lost her daughter. I felt just terrible. It's a very, very brave move on her part to have come by.
I don't know if it was just what the default was, but it really seemed the police felt that someone had kidnapped Jennifer and was going to contact us for ransom in exchange to get her back. On my dad's birthday, August 8th, the press conference we did in the Point Defiance Park was actually aimed to the kidnapper. We were told that whoever took her would surely be watching the news and would hear us talking. It was like our plea to this phantom kidnapper.
And as a result of all of the media coverage, a lot of people did call in and reported seeing Jennifer in the park that day. So investigators knew she was there.
Detectives run down every tip, but none of them lead to Jennifer.
There was a jogger who was part of a YMCA running club, and he was jogging through the trails at Point Defiance Park and noticed a really foul odor off of one of the trails. So he called the park police, and the park police came and tried to locate the source of this odor, but they could not locate it. So they called Tacoma police. Tacoma police came out, they brought a canine out, and they still could not locate the source of this odor.
On August 28th, 24 days after Jennifer vanished, her family's worst fears come true. A search and rescue team finds her remains near the 5-mile drive.
It was apparent to the investigators at the time that she had been sexually assaulted just based on the positioning of her body and the positioning of her clothing when she was found. The two cases of Michella and Jennifer were so similar that a lot of people thought there must be some deranged serial killer on the loose. People were on edge. People were questioning, do we have a serial killer in Tacoma? Is there going to be another victim?
Every single day, a police officer named Pat O'Malley had been assigned to come in the morning to inform the family of what the police were going to do to look for Jennifer today, and in the evening, come and tell the family what the results of that were. I never gave up hope. I distinctly remember around noonish being on the ladder painting I just heard the latch on the screen door go, and it was Pat walking in. And he walked up to the ladder, and he reached up and he took the paintbrush out of my hand, and he helped me down the ladder and sat me on a chair, and he said, "We found her." And truthfully, I can't remember who said what or what was said or how it was said. But the two detectives that worked on the case were there and explained as much as they could, as gently as they could.
Her body itself was positioned on its back, arms above her head, knees somewhat bent and out to the side. Her bathing suit was pulled down to her right ankle. Her bicycle was located maybe 60 feet away. Because of the level of decomposition, it was very difficult to tell for certain, but there was a ligature that was around her neck, and based on everything that we saw and everything that we knew, we believe that was most likely going to be the cause of death. That was subsequently confirmed at autopsy.
The murder of a second young girl sparks a wave of fear.
I went to college in Washington State in Seattle, and I remember hearing about both of the murders and just being horrified. There's nothing more all-American than kids out riding their bikes in our parks, in our beautiful state. And to have two of them within a few months of each other snatched off their bicycles, raped and murdered with no sense of who's out there doing this. Tacoma now believes there's a serial rapist and killer on the loose. And everyone's just on the edge wondering, will they catch this person before he strikes again?
This was in the background of my childhood. I was thinking some wacko is going to jump out of the bushes and grab me.
After that summer, I never rode a bike again.
As the investigation intensifies, the people of Tacoma come together to support the Bastian family and say goodbye to Jennifer.
As we were leaving, I glanced up and saw that foyer was filled with law enforcement. Not in uniform. These were moms and dads. These were family people who cared and felt and had journeyed with us. That was a pretty powerful statement.
Tacoma police get help from the Green River Task Force to investigate the number of incoming tips.
Based on the similarities between the two cases, it was believed that the same person must be responsible for both cases. So detectives were following up on the hundreds of leads that were coming in.
Fairly early on, there was a potential suspect identified. He, to some extent at least, lived out of his van. The thing that was very compelling about him was that he spent a great deal of time at Point Defiance Park in the parking lot, and somebody that there had been a number of issues with over the years. Once he was identified as a potential suspect, it was a matter of locating him, and it was my partner and I that located him down on the waterfront of Tacoma. The van was detained, as was he, and a search of the van then took place. During the course of that search, there's a number of things that were interesting to us. One of the items was a wooden mallet type thing that was roughly 3 inches around, and it was actually relatively close in size to the injury that Michelle had sustained on her head. Additionally, there was a number of drawings within the vehicle that had juvenile females in rather explicit positions, but nothing that was specifically able to be associated with either one of the victims. And he provided a DNA sample voluntarily and was able to be excluded because of the DNA that had been found in Michelle's case.
By the summer of 1987, new leads coming in vanish like tiny leaves in the forest wind, and the case goes cold.
This case originally had multiple detectives assigned to it as part of this task force. but eventually the leads had pretty much dried up.
It's a very difficult thing to be intimately involved in these investigations and to not be making progress.
It was very clear that they had done everything that was possible. They were extremely, extremely professional. And that's got to be hard when the person you're going to see wants an answer and you don't have it.
We already had Ted Bundy. And in 1986, the Green River Killer was in full force. So we had a history in our area of really brutal serial killings. The Green River Killer became active, and King County police started finding bodies of young women on the banks of the Green River and in the Green River, which was the county north of us. And everyone knew about that case because it was huge. There was some evaluation done at that time.
The victimology was totally different. The location of occurrence, Pierce County rather than in King County. There was really nothing that suggested that these were or could even potentially be linked to the Green River Killer. Really, the department took ownership of these cases and made me want to be a homicide detective one day, and then subsequently made me want to start the cold case unit. And just that, we got to find a way to solve them. When I began to develop the cold case unit for the Tacoma Police Department, I collected information on all the unsolved homicides that took place in the city of Tacoma. It was during the course of putting all of that information together that I identified 2 other juvenile females that had been the victims of sexual assault homicides in 1986. The thing that was very interesting about it was one of the victims, Denise Sally, went missing in January 1986. Her body was subsequently located just a few days after Michelle had passed. So you have 4 juvenile females, all within Pierce County. So I began looking at the overall case files of both Jenny Bastian, Michelle Welch, and then Denise Sally and Kimberly Payne on the county side. And there was a name that continued to show up on occasion. It was Timothy Burkhart. I start looking and I'm able to identify a Timothy Ray Burkhart. And it was when I dug into that name that it piqued my curiosity. Timothy Burkhart, at the time that the cases occurred, was a 20-year-old male. And in looking at his criminal history, it's rather limited. But there is one case where he's a suspect in an attempt abduction about 1.5 years prior to the Denise Sally case. As I looked further into him, I actually found that he was listed as a suspect in 2 homicides that occurred in 2001. I looked further and found that he had actually committed suicide. And as a result, those cases were never able to be fully adjudicated.
Using evidence found at the 2001 crime scenes, the State Crime Lab develops a DNA profile of Timothy Burkhart.
What we ended up learning was that Timothy Ray Burkhart's DNA matched the evidence from the Kimberly Payne homicide. So that links him to Kimberly Payne and Denise Sally, but is not consistent with the profile developed in the Michelle Welch case. So the bad news was Jenny and Michelle's cases were still unsolved. Detective Wade and I were actually partners when we worked SAU cases, special assaults, sex crimes. And so whenever I needed something, she was kind of my go-to person for help.
While speaking with a forensic expert, Detectives Miller and Wade are advised to submit Jennifer's swimsuit to the crime lab. The hope is to obtain a reference DNA sample for Jennifer, in case it's needed in the future.
So Gene submits Jennifer's swimsuit to the crime lab, and a few months later, he gets a call from the crime lab, and the forensic scientist says to Gene, hey, are you interested in the male DNA that we found on Jennifer's swimsuit? It was like, what do you mean, male DNA? The scientist tells Gene that there is male DNA in the form of spermatozoa in the crotch of Jennifer's swimsuit. And this is a bombshell because not only are we learning for the first time that we do have DNA evidence from an unknown perpetrator, but we also learn at that same time that this DNA profile was entered into the state and the national DNA database, and it did not match the DNA in the Michelle Welch case. This is crazy. We have two different killers. Like, what is going on? So the first thing that Gene did was to go back through and look at who had been identified and eliminated previously, either by alibi or in some cases by DNA, and then pull those people back up again and resubmit their samples so that they could be compared against the DNA profile in Jennifer's case.
Detectives submit the DNA found on Jennifer's swimsuit to CODIS, but there's no match. With the case still unsolved at the end of 2014, Detective Gene Miller makes the difficult decision to retire, leaving the case with Detective Wade.
Detective Wade is one of those people that if you're a bad guy, you do not want her in your rearview mirror because she will not quit.
This was a case that I grew up with, and I wanted to know what happened. When I took over the case, I recognized that the cases were so massive that I took on the daunting task of creating a database so that I could take every single male name that appeared in either one of the cases, and I entered that name into this database, along with whether or not they had DNA in CODIS, whether or not we had collected their DNA as a part of the investigation. Were they dead? Were they incarcerated? There were like 2,300 plus names in the database.
As Detective Wade searches for Jennifer's killer, the Bastian family mourns another loss. In 2015, Jennifer's father dies. He goes to the grave without seeing justice done.
Our faith has seen us through a lot. And sure, he wanted to know. You carry the burden you carry. That's just life and its natural progression. When you've got a burden, you carry it. We all do.
I met Patty and Ralph in 2013, working on the case, and I can't explain it, but for whatever reason, Patty and I just clicked, and she was really inspirational to me. We got to really know each other on a deeper level and, really gained a mutual respect for each other.
In early 2015, FBI agent Terry Postma, working from one of the FBI's satellite offices, helps Detective Wade with the case by obtaining DNA samples from a wider pool of possible suspects.
One of the primary roles is to collaborate on cases and investigations. How we prioritized who we were going to collect DNA from was based on the reason they were originally included in the investigation.
One sample leads them outside of Tacoma to Aberdeen.
We believe that this individual is living there in Aberdeen, right? And so we have a couple of addresses, and Lindsay and I went to the local police department there. They're like, oh yeah, this guy lives down here by the river. They took us to him. The van is just packed full of stuff. You can't even see that he's in there. He had stuff strapped onto the back of the van. It was pretty surreal, but you just never knew, right? You never knew. Is this gonna be him? He was parked in a van under his overpass, living in the van right next to the river that goes through Aberdeen there. Obviously, we'd introduce ourselves, right? I'm Detective Wade from Tacoma Police Department, and this is FBI Special Agent Postma. The reason that we're here today is in relation to a cold case homicide from 1986, and we would like to eliminate you as a suspect. And he willingly gave the sample.
Analysts run the DNA sample, but it's another letdown. The DNA from the man in Aberdeen doesn't match the DNA found in Jennifer's swimsuit.
Here we have Jenny's case that's actively being investigated, and we have a profile. We don't know whose it is. It's frustrating, right? It's frustrating.
Despite the years of frustration and all the dead ends, Detective Wade never gives up.
This case was so important to me for many reasons. I never dreamed as a youngster that I would be in a position one day to work on the case.
Lindsay worked so hard on these two cases. She was 11 years old when this happened to Jenny. There's just something about Lindsay and her total dedication, her total involvement, her intelligence. She gave so much for us as a community.
With leads once again running thin, Detective Wade learns of a murder case in Arizona.
I had heard about a woman named Colleen Fitzpatrick who had helped the Phoenix Police Department solve these cold cases from, I think it was 1990 or 91. And I had talked to the detectives on that case, and when they told me what she had done using genealogy, I was intrigued, to say the least. So with the help of the FBI, we were able to pay for Colleen's assistance in working on the case. Our crime lab basically created a profile from the DNA from the swimsuit, and YSTR DNA is DNA that's passed down from father to son. And so theoretically, if you follow the paternal line, the last name should stay the same. We gave Colleen the YSTR profile. She did her research and looked through her genealogy databases and came up with 3 potential last names for the suspect based on that DNA. The 3 names were Smith, Holbrook, and Washburn. No one in the case file named Holbrook. So I went back and I looked at Washburn, and I saw that a guy named Robert Washburn had called in a tip back in May of 1986 in Michelle's case. So this was before Jennifer was killed.
And he says that he had seen a jogger, and he often jogs in Point Defiance Park. And he had seen someone through there that maybe they should look at, someone that might be suspicious.
The detectives, they didn't find anything unusual about him. And so they just wrote the report up and moved on to continue investigating. He made it into my high priority offender pile of people that I wanted to get DNA from, but he certainly wasn't the only one.
His name is there, so they have to try to get some answers.
We would have done the basic record checks and determined that he was most likely living there in Illinois, had a house address, had his driver's license and photo. I contacted the local FBI resident agency and provided them with the necessary information and said, we're asking people to voluntarily provide their DNA samples so they can be eliminated as a suspect. Can you have somebody go out and attempt to contact this person?
The FBI goes to Washburn and says, can we have your DNA? And he says, sure, and he gives it to him.
I called the agent out there. I asked him, was there anything remarkable about your contact with him? And it was just very routine, very straightforward.
I mean, what is going on here? I don't know if we're ever going to get to the bottom of the case. There were days when I would go into my office and I would look at the stacks of case files and think, this case is unsolvable. once we had collected all of these DNA samples, we decided to start submitting them to the crime lab. That this honestly is kind of like searching for a needle in a haystack. The first batch came back with no matches. Then I sent the second batch and waited for months. I sent my last batch of samples to the crime lab in January of 2018. And by this point, I was not optimistic at all that anybody in these samples was the suspect.
As she waits for results from this last batch of samples, Detective Wade is forced to make a difficult choice.
I had been approached to apply for a job with the Attorney General's office to work on the sexual assault kit initiative. And I did a lot of soul searching, trying to decide, like, do I really want to leave now? But that's ultimately what I decided to do. The hardest part about leaving is not having solved Jennifer and Michelle's cases. Like, it was just terrible. But there was something in the back of my mind that thought, maybe working on the sexual assault kit testing will provide an answer. Maybe one of these untested sexual assault kits will provide a match. My last day was April 13th, 2018, and I was gone 25 days, and I get a phone call. It was from the detective who took over for me, and he said, "Are you sitting down?" And he tells me, "We have a match on Jennifer Bastian." I'm speechless at this point, and I'm also like tearing up. So I'm like, "Well, who is it? What's the name?" And he says, "It's Robert Washburn." I got dressed really quick and then went back to the station so that I could help dig through the case to pull out the information about Robert Washburn.
Robert Washburn graduated from high school in the Tacoma area and worked for a while as an engineer at Boeing. He moved to Illinois and was living a very quiet life caring for his disabled daughter. Neighbors described him, it's almost a cliche, as the quiet guy who kind of kept to himself, but seemed dedicated to his daughter.
At the time of Jennifer's murder, Robert Washburn was living just 9 blocks from the Bastian family.
Someone in our office here in Tacoma called out there and let them know that Tacoma PD would be coming out, that there was a match to this person, and they would have a warrant for his arrest.
They got eyes on Robert Washburn pretty quickly, and the SWAT team in Eureka arrest him.
Police arrest Washburn and begin his extradition to Washington.
I think the arrest took place around 7 a.m., and so immediately one of the assistant chiefs and myself drove from the police department to Patty's home and knocked on her door. I had rehearsed in my head something to say to her. Of course, it all went out the window, and I couldn't remember what I was going to say.
Doorbell rings, open the door, and she just says, "We got him." Lindsay and I are hugging one another and alternately crying and laughing and crying and laughing. Just the raw emotion. Just an awesome, awesome reality that took over. And my first thought, I gotta call Teresa.
She does the whole, "I've got someone here who wants to say something to you." And then I hear Teresa, "It's Lindsay. We got him." And I dropped to my knees. I just said, "Tell me everything." When I heard the name Robert Washburn, it didn't mean anything to me. I couldn't come up with anything. I don't know any connection.
Robert Washburn is behind bars. He's voluntarily given his DNA. It matches to Jennifer Bastian, to the evidence left at the crime scene, but he pleads not guilty. And we all know anything can happen in a jury room. Will they trust that that DNA was preserved? It's decades old. Was it tested properly? So there is still a very real fear that he could get away with murder.
We had hoped that Robert Washburn would talk and answer a lot of the questions that we all have, but he declined to do that.
Two weeks after his arrest, 60-year-old Robert Washburn is arraigned in a Pierce County court and charged with the first-degree murder of Jennifer Bastian. Washburn pleads not guilty.
My overwhelming fear was that this case would go to trial because my mom is in Tacoma alone, and I really was quite anxious and fearful about what that would look like.
I think the idea of a trial was the biggest black cloud since his arrest. There's a bunch of things that he may have to say that I don't want to know.
As a family, no one wants to sit through that. No one wants to sit in the courtroom and look at graphic photographs of their family member who's been sexually assaulted and murdered. I mean, that's horrifying.
A judge sets a 2019 trial date, but just 3 months later, the Bastian family receives a phone call that changes everything.
It was the prosecutor saying they felt Washburn was ready to change his plea. They were clear it wouldn't necessarily be the longest sentence they would hope for, but under the situation, it would be no trial, and given his age, it kind of made sense to not push the issue.
It took 32 long, painful years, but finally the Bastian family gets a measure of justice.
Walking into the courtroom that day was really intense because it's all kind of overwhelming to see so many old friends and family and colleagues of my dad, but made it really clear how important this case was still for so many people.
I mean, Lindsay tried to prepare me, but I knew I was going to see him. I wanted to see him.
And then when it was our time to walk into the courtroom and stand in the same room as him, it was impactful, but it also left a lot to be desired because he didn't make eye contact. He just kind of sat there.
There was no eye to eye. He never raised his head. He looked down the whole time.
I went to the sentencing, and it was really emotional. I don't think there was a dry eye in the courtroom, from the judge to one of the cameramen in the courtroom to people in the gallery. I remember Patty saying, "Do you know how many birthdays we missed and how many Christmases we missed?" I mean, you pretty much have to be a psychopath to sit through that and not tear up.
As the Bastian family watches, Washburn admits he murdered Jennifer back in 1986.
He's strangely stoic in the courtroom. A written statement is read saying, he's sorry. He admits that he grabbed Jennifer and strangled her. He never admits to or talks about the sexual assault. And there's very little revealed about his motives, why he did it, how he did it, other than that he strangled this little girl.
He basically confessed in the most bare bones way possible that he had murdered Jennifer, period.
Robert Washburn is sentenced to 26 and a half years in prison.
Me as a detective, I want to solve the case, and I'm excited when the case is solved. But that family is now ripping off a scab, and all the pain, all the grief, all the trauma, it's back. That's something that has to really be considered and addressed from the law enforcement perspective when one of these cases is solved, is that it's not just happy feelings.
That is not the end for Patty, and it's not the end for Teresa. This family is determined to make sure that this isn't just about one girl's murder or two girls' murders, This is about keeping young people safer everywhere.
So starting in 2015, we teamed up and we introduced a number of bills to really move forward on the DNA collection. We had people leaving the court that had never given their DNA and all kind of problems. And then in 2018, we passed House Bill 1326 is when we really brought it all together to expand who we collect the DNA from and closing the most loopholes. It was bipartisan support, and it was really a huge team effort with Patty and Detective Wade.
On May 21st, 2019, the governor of Washington, with Patty Bastian by his side, signs the new legislation, now named Jennifer and Michelle's Law.
Thank you for never letting us feel alone over the past 32 years.
The fact that the bill itself was named the Jennifer and Michelle's Law is just pretty awesome. Pretty darned awesome.
On March 22nd, 2022, a Pierce County man is found guilty of Michelle Welch's murder. He is sentenced to more than 26 years in prison. DNA evidence helps link him to the crime.
This country needs a national law about what to do with DNA, when to collect it, when to put it in the database, and it's got to be before a felon is released from prison. It's to help the guilty and the innocent. It's to help parents and people who have lost someone, as well as help prevent, period.
The line between historical fact and urban legend is often blurred by time, whispered rumors, and the natural human inclination to make sense of the incomprehensible. When a crime is so deeply disturbing, so thoroughly submerged in cruelty and darkness, society sometimes transforms it into a ghost story. It becomes a tale told to frighten children, a campfire narrative designed to shock, or even the gruesome inspiration for cinema. In the annals of American crime, specifically within the sprawling, sun-baked expanses of Texas, few stories have crossed so seamlessly into the realm of dark folklore as the case of the man known as the Elmendorf Butcher. Decades after the events transpired, the sheer horror of what was alleged to have happened in a small, dusty town would inspire the gruesome 1976 horror film Eaten Alive. The cinematic portrayal focused on the visceral terror of a monstrous predator and a man who fed his victims to the beasts. But beneath the celluloid horror and the sensationalized folklore lies a reality that is far more tragic, far more somber, and intimately connected to the lives of real women who were systematically erased from the world. To understand the gravity of these disappearances and the sinister environment in which they occurred, one must first understand the landscape of 1930s Texas. The era was defined by a collective thirst for release. The country was navigating the turbulent aftermath of Prohibition, a period that had driven the consumption of alcohol underground and fostered a culture of illicit gatherings. With the repeal of Prohibition, establishments that served liquor burst back into the open, eager to attract patrons who were desperate for entertainment, socialization, and a temporary escape from the lingering hardships of the Great Depression. In the small, rural town of Elmendorf, located just a short distance from the bustling center of San Antonio, the landscape was dominated by heat, dust, and quiet desperation. It was here that a man named Joe Ball saw an opportunity to capitalize on the shifting cultural tide. Joe Ball was a figure who understood the dark psychology of attraction. He opened a saloon, aptly named the Sociable Inn, a title that masked the deeply unsociable horrors that would eventually unfold within its vicinity. The saloon was designed to be a beacon for travelers, locals, and anyone seeking a cold drink and a distraction from their daily lives. However, Joe Ball recognized that in a post-Prohibition world, a simple tavern was not enough to guarantee a steady stream of revenue and a fiercely loyal clientele. He needed a spectacle. He needed something visceral, something that would tap into the primal curiosity of the public and make his establishment a mandatory stop in South Texas. His solution was as bizarre as it was cruel. Directly behind the Sociable Inn, he ordered the excavation of a large, man-made pond. This was not a decorative feature meant to bring tranquility to the patrons. Into this murky, stagnant water, Joe Ball introduced 5 live alligators. The presence of these apex predators in the backyard of a rural Texas saloon was an immediate sensation. The alligators became the central attraction of the sociable inn, drawing crowds who were morbidly fascinated by the deadly reptiles. But the mere presence of the animals was only the beginning of the spectacle. Joe Ball transformed the feeding of these creatures into a horrifying public event. Regular patrons and curious onlookers would gather around the perimeter of the enclosure, their faces flushed with alcohol and anticipation, waiting for the show to begin. With a chilling theatricality, Joe would source live animals from the surrounding area. He would bring out squawking chickens, stray dogs, and feral cats, and before a cheering, captive audience, he would toss the terrified, living creatures into the water. The water would violently erupt as the 5 alligators swarmed, tearing the live animals apart in a frenzy of prehistoric brutality. The patrons watched this carnage with a mixture of revulsion and thrill, clapping and shouting as the water churned with blood. This spectacle normalized violence at the sociable inn. It conditioned the audience to view cruelty as entertainment and painted Joe Ball as a dominant, fearless ringmaster who held the power of life and death over the creatures in his domain. Yet, while the crowd focused their attention on the savage displays in the alligator pit, a much quieter, far more sinister pattern was beginning to take shape within the walls of the saloon itself. The sociable inn relied heavily on female staff to serve drinks, entertain the patrons, and keep the atmosphere lively. Joe Ball employed a rotating cast of young women as waitresses and dancers. These were women who, like many during that era, were simply trying to earn a living in a difficult economic climate. Along with the staff, Joe Ball was known to have a string of romantic partners and former wives who frequented the property. Beginning in the mid-1930s, a terrifying phenomenon began to plague the sociable inn. The women associated with Joe Ball started to vanish. These were not isolated incidents. One by one, waitresses who served drinks to the rowdy crowds, dancers who performed in the dim light of the tavern, and women who had shared Joe Ball's bed simply disappeared without a trace. They left behind their belongings, their paychecks, and their families. The sudden absence of these women created a heavy, unspoken void in the small community. When anxious mothers, concerned siblings, or worried friends would inevitably come looking for their missing loved ones, they would eventually find their way to the sociable inn to confront the proprietor. Joe Ball always met these inquiries with a perfectly practiced, chillingly calm demeanor. He never appeared panicked or defensive. Instead, he would lean against the bar, looking the desperate relatives in the eye, and offer a variety of plausible, mundane explanations. He would state with absolute confidence that the woman in question had simply grown tired of Elmendorf and boarded a bus to seek a better life in a larger city. Alternatively, he would claim that she had suddenly eloped with a new lover, running off into the night without a word to anyone, or that she had abruptly quit her job and moved on. For a time, these lies held the darkness at bay. The rural setting, the transient nature of tavern work, and the lack of modern communication made it entirely possible for someone to start a new life without leaving a trail. But as the number of missing women continued to grow, the calm excuses provided by Joe Ball began to ring hollow. The silence left by the vanished waitresses and girlfriends was soon filled by a different kind of noise. A deeply unsettling rumor began to slither through the dusty streets of Elmendorf. The patrons who had cheered as live dogs and cats were torn apart in the muddy water behind the saloon began to cast nervous glances toward the alligator pit. A foul, overwhelming stench of decaying flesh began to emanate from the enclosure, a smell so thick and putrid that it hung over the sociable in like a physical weight. The locals started to whisper that the meat being thrown into the churning water was not always animal in origin. The terrifying theory took hold that Joe Ball was murdering the women who vanished from his life, dismembering their bodies, and feeding their remains to his 5 alligators. The implication was clear and horrifying. He was using the beasts not just for entertainment, but as an undetectable method of absolute disposal. He was relying on the hungry reptiles to destroy the evidence of his crimes, leaving no bodies for the grieving families to bury and no proof for the authorities to find. The tension surrounding the sociable inn escalated over several years until it reached a breaking point in the late summer of 1938. The catalyst for the unraveling of Joe Ball's macabre empire was the disappearance of a young employee named Hazel Brown. Unlike some of the other women whose absences had been smoothed over by Joe's smooth talking, Hazel's disappearance drew the intense scrutiny of law enforcement. On the 24th of September, 1938, investigators arrived at the sociable inn. Their intention was clear. They were there to bring Joe Ball into the station for formal questioning regarding the vanishing of Hazel Brown. The authorities walked into the saloon, expecting to find the calm, dismissive proprietor who had confidently lied to so many anxious families. As the investigators approached the counter, the illusion of control that Joe Ball had maintained for years instantly shattered. Faced with the reality of an official inquiry and the terrifying prospect that his carefully constructed facade was finally crumbling, the Elmendorf butcher made a final, decisive move. Standing behind the cash register of the very establishment where he had lured his victims, in full view of the stunned law enforcement officers, Joe Ball reached beneath the wooden counter. He did not pull out a ledger, nor did he offer another calm excuse. Instead, his hand emerged gripping a handgun. Without hesitation, without offering a single word of explanation or confession to the bewildered detectives, he turned the weapon upon himself. He aimed the barrel directly at his own heart and pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the empty saloon, a violent, deafening end to the life of a predator. Joe Ball collapsed and died instantly, taking the full truth of his monstrous actions into the dark with him. The immediate aftermath of his public suicide was a landscape of chaos and unanswered questions. The man who held the key to the fate of up to 20 missing women was dead on the floor of his own tavern. However, the wall of silence did not remain intact for long. The horrific reality of what had transpired behind the sociable inn had not been completely isolated to Joe Ball alone. A handyman and subordinate named Clifford Wheeler, who had worked closely with Joe, was paralyzed by fear following the suicide of his domineering employer. Terrified of being implicated in the sprawling web of murder, Wheeler came forward and surrendered to the authorities. His confession would finally crack the foundation of the Elmendorf mystery. Wheeler admitted to being an accomplice after the fact. He told the investigators a story of cold-blooded murder that stripped away the myth of the alligator pit and replaced it with a grim, undeniable forensic reality. Wheeler guided the police away from the saloon and out into a desolate, isolated area near the San Antonio River. There, beneath the unforgiving Texas soil, he directed them to dig. The earth yielded the tragic, indisputable evidence of Joe Ball's savagery. The authorities unearthed the buried remains of the recently missing Hazel Brown, as well as the body of another vanished woman, Minnie Gotthard. Wheeler provided a chillingly straightforward account, confirming that Joe Ball had not relied on his alligators to kill these women. Instead, he had personally and methodically executed them with a firearm before utilizing Wheeler to help conceal their corpses in the dirt. The recovery of Hazel and Minnie provided a sliver of tragic closure, but it also left a sprawling, haunting mystery unresolved. While forensic evidence and Wheeler's testimony proved that Joe Ball had murdered and buried at least 2 women, the fate of the remaining dozen or more missing waitresses and girlfriends lingered in the realm of terrifying speculation. The 5 alligators, the silent witnesses to the horrors of the sociable inn, were confiscated by the authorities and transported to the San Antonio Zoo. Investigators harbored deep suspicions that the animals had indeed been used as biological incinerators for other victims. However, the scientific limitations of the 1930s proved to be an insurmountable hurdle. The forensic technology of the era was wholly inadequate to analyze the digestive tracts of the living reptiles or to sift through the mud of the enclosure to conclusively identify human remains that had been subjected to the savage jaws of the animals. The authorities could not definitively prove whether the horrifying rumors that had terrified Elmendorf were true, or if they were simply the dark projections of a town trying to comprehend a serial killer in their midst. The story of Joe Ball thus remains a fragmented nightmare, a puzzle missing its most crucial pieces. He was a man who weaponized the post-prohibition desire for entertainment, transforming a small-town tavern into a hunting ground. He used spectacle to blind a community to the slaughter happening right in front of them, replacing the lives of vulnerable women with a gruesome sideshow. The verified graves near the river tell a story of brutal, direct murder, but the murky waters of the alligator pit hold secrets that will never be uncovered. The legend of the Elmendorf butcher continues to echo through history, a chilling reminder of how easily human life can be discarded and how sometimes the monsters we invent in our folklore pale in comparison to the predators who pour our drinks and smile from across the counter. To truly grasp the darkness of this series of disappearances and the tragedy that unfolded in the shadow of the sociable inn, it is absolutely essential to step away from the figure of the murderer for a moment and focus on the environment that allowed such acts to occur, as well as on the lives of those who were victims. Crime history often has the unfortunate tendency to remember the perpetrator while erasing the names of those who suffered, reducing complex human lives to mere statistics or props in a killer's macabre narrative. In the case of the atrocities committed in Elmendorf, restoring the victim's dignity begins with a careful examination of the stifling reality of 1930s Texas, a time and place that shaped their vulnerability and facilitated their silent erasure. The 1930s in the United States were deeply scarred by the Great Depression. The entire country is mired in unprecedented economic hardship, and South Texas is no exception to this harsh reality. It is a land swept by dust, crushed by relentless heat, where daily survival is a constant struggle for the working class. Alongside this financial distress, American society is undergoing a major cultural shift with the end of Prohibition. The return of legal alcohol creates an explosive demand for places of entertainment, socializing, and escapism. Taverns, bars, and saloons spring up like mushrooms, offering temporary refuge from the harshness of the outside world. It is at this precise historical crossroads, at the intersection of economic despair and the need for entertainment, that the small rural town of Elmendorf finds its place. Located not far from the bustle of San Antonio, Elmendorf is an isolated town, a microcosm where everyone knows everyone else, but also a stopover for anonymous travelers. This geographical and social isolation is crucial to understanding how women could disappear repeatedly without triggering an immediate, widespread alarm. At the heart of this dynamic is the sociable inn, the establishment run by Joe Ball. Unlike the speakeasies of the Prohibition era, which had to operate in secrecy, the sociable inn is a public place, noisy and deceptively welcoming. However, the work environment within this saloon is inherently dangerous and deeply unbalanced. To attract a predominantly male clientele of local workers, passing travelers, and thrill seekers, the bar requires a constant female presence. The women employed at the sociable inn work as waitresses, bringing drinks in an atmosphere thick with smoke and alcohol, or as dancers, tasked with keeping the party going and enticing customers into the early hours. This role places them in a position of extreme subordination and vulnerability. They are subjected daily to harassment, brutality, and the demands of an intoxicated clientele, all while being entirely dependent on their employer for their wages and safety in a world that offers very little legal or social protection to precarious workers. The profile of these victims is not a coincidence. The women who gravitate around Joe Ball, whether as employees, girlfriends, or even ex-wives, often share common characteristics that make them particularly susceptible to falling into his trap. In the context of the Great Depression, many of these young women come from modest backgrounds, sometimes estranged from their families, desperately seeking financial independence or simply a means of survival. Working in a rural saloon is rarely a career choice. It is often a necessity for survival. This economic insecurity is accompanied by social insecurity. As waitresses or dancers in a country bar, they are frequently judged by the respectable society of the time. They operate in a gray area of social respectability, which means that their disappearances are likely to be met with indifference or cynicism by the authorities and public opinion. The psychological dynamics established by Joe Ball are terrifyingly banal. He uses his status as a business owner, employer, and influential local figure to exert absolute control over these women. For the young waitresses, he represents their sole source of income. For his romantic partners, He manipulates affection and dependence. When a woman starts working at the sociable inn, she enters a physical and psychological space dominated by a single man. The establishment centerpiece, the infamous tank housing 5 live alligators, plays an insidious role in this power dynamic. Although presented as an attraction to entertain the crowds, the presence of these deadly predators, just steps from the women's workplace, creates an underlying climate of terror. Witnessing the alligators' bloody meals, seeing live animals thrown to the wolves while their boss laughs, constitutes a constant demonstration of power. It's a silent but crystal clear message sent to his employees and loved ones. He is the master of the place, he holds the power of life and death, and he has a means of absolute destruction at his fingertips. This normalized violence, integrated into the very fabric of their workplace, contributes to paralyzing potential victims and stifling any desire for rebellion. Of the many women who mysteriously vanished after crossing paths with Joe Ball, the majority remain nameless ghosts, silhouettes erased by time and the lack of evidence. However, the investigation allows us to put a name and a tragic reality to at least 2 of these shattered lives, Hazel Brown and Minnie Gotthard. These 2 women embody the absolute horror of the Elmendorf killer's methods, and their stories, though tragically cut short, provide the human anchor necessary to understand the gravity of the case. Hazel Brown represents the quintessential young employee. As a member of the sociable and staff, she was immersed daily in the saloon's toxic environment. Her disappearance, which ultimately triggered Joe Ball's downfall in 1938, underscores the inherent risk faced by the women working at this establishment. Hazel was not merely an anonymous employee. She was a young woman with a future, hopes, and most likely loved ones who were worried about her prolonged absence. The fact that it was her specific disappearance that finally prompted investigators to appear at the sociable inn's counter indicates that she had left a trace, that someone, somewhere, refused to accept Joe Ball's habitual lies. Her death, coldly executed by gunshot before her body was buried in the barren Texas soil, is a testament to the sudden and definitive violence that could befall those who caused trouble or tried to escape the owner's control. Minnie Gotthard, for her part, adds another layer of complexity to the web woven by the killer. Her name, indelibly linked to the gruesome discoveries made near the San Antonio River, confirms that the threat wasn't limited to new recruits or temporary employees, but extended to a potentially wider circle of personal relationships. Minnie's murder, like Hazel's, demonstrates chilling premeditation and cold-bloodedness. She was shot, her life abruptly ended, and then her body was treated like mere garbage to be buried far from prying eyes. The fact that both women were buried clandestinely, with the help of an accomplice driven by fear, reveals the macabre machinery Joe Ball had put in place to erase the traces of his crimes, regardless of the urban legend involving alligators. The tragedy of these women, Hazel, Minnie, and dozens of other vanished wives, girlfriends, and dancers, lay in the ease with which the world let them disappear. For months, even years, Joe Ball's flippant explanations were enough to deflect questions. When he confidently asserted that a waitress had quit overnight to run off with a new lover, or that a former partner had decided to start a new life in a distant big city, he was deliberately exploiting the prejudices of his time. He knew that society would view the sudden departure of a woman working in a saloon as fickle, predictable, almost expected. He used the transient nature of their lives and the lack of social standing they suffered as a shield to conceal his murders. The absence of these women created a deafening silence in the small town of Elmendorf, a silence that was eventually filled with rumor and fear. The stench emanating from the alligator pool became the physical metaphor for the moral decay that consumed the sociable inn. Each passing day without a family receiving a letter, without a mother seeing her daughter again, cemented the tragedy. These women, who came seeking a wage, a little independence, or perhaps affection, found instead a violent and anonymous end. By reconstructing the context of their time and the psychological hell of the saloon where they worked, we begin to grasp the magnitude of the trap that had closed around them. They were not actresses in a horror film or mere props in the urban legend of a man who fed monsters. They were the true victims of a human predator, methodically erased from a world that only became aware of their true worth when it was tragically too late. Their secret graves on the banks of the San Antonio River are a sad memorial to a time when a woman's life could be swept away with disconcerting ease, buried under a man's lies and the relentless dust of South Texas. To truly grasp the macabre machinery that was set in motion in Elmendorf, one must immerse oneself in the deceptive routine of the Sociable Inn, an establishment that operated like a well-oiled machine under the implacable direction of Joe Ball. Every night, the tavern lit up, drawing thirsty crowds from all over the region to drown their sorrows in alcohol and forget the harshness of the Great Depression that was ravaging the country. Music echoed through the worn wooden walls, overlaid by the constant hubbub of lively conversations, bursts of male laughter, and the incessant clinking of beer glasses. At the center of this daily bustle were the employees, young women hired specifically to serve, smile, and endure the often inappropriate remarks of a boisterous, drunken clientele. They were the welcoming face of the inn, nimbly flitting between the smoky tables, carrying trays heavy with spirits while trying to maintain an atmosphere of lightheartedness. Joe Ball, for his part, oversaw his domain with quiet authority, observing every interaction from his privileged position behind the solid wood bar or strolling among his patrons with the overwhelming confidence of a predator dominating its natural territory. But behind this facade of rustic camaraderie and cheap entertainment, a deeply sinister dynamic was beginning to take shape in the shadows, gradually transforming this festive gathering place into a veritable abyss where human lives seemed to vanish without a trace. The transition from reassuring normality to absolute nightmare was not abrupt, but rather like a slow, insidious poison gradually seeping into the veins of a credulous community. The first unmistakable sign of this anomaly was the sudden disappearance of one of the waitresses, an event which, taken in isolation, shouldn't have aroused major suspicion in a precarious industry where staff turnover was commonplace. A young woman who, just the day before, had been diligently serving drinks and chatting cheerfully with the regulars, simply didn't show up for work the next morning. Her personal belongings, sometimes hastily left in the cramped back room, also vanished inexplicably, and her absence created a temporary void that the owner hastened to fill immediately by hiring a new recruit, often just as vulnerable and isolated. When the regulars, driven by simple curiosity or a more personal interest in the young woman, inquired about the missing waitress, Joe Ball's response was always delivered with disconcerting ease and truly Olympian calm. He would claim, with a slightly convincing shrug, that the employee had suddenly decided to pack her bags in a hurry, driven by an irrepressible desire for change or lured by the brighter lights and opportunities of a distant big city. At other times, he would recount, with a knowing smile and a conspiratorial glance, that she had run away in the dead of night with a mysterious passing lover, deliberately choosing to sever all ties with her dusty past in Elmendorf. These explanations, distressingly banal, were perfectly calibrated to satisfy the superficial curiosity of the male clientele and to skillfully exploit the persistent social prejudices of the time that viewed these itinerant saloon workers as inherently unstable, unreliable, and fundamentally fickle. No one in the community publicly questioned the word of the town's strongman, and the tavern's frenetic pace invariably resumed, quickly drowning the memory of the missing woman in fresh rounds of booze. However, the exceptional nature of these sudden departures began to fade dangerously, giving way to a repetitive and deeply disturbing pattern that could no longer be ignored. It was no longer one or two women disappearing sporadically, but a disturbing succession of regular employees, occasional dancers, and even Joe Ball's intimate companions who were literally vanishing one after another without any logical explanation. The Sociable Inn had quietly become a kind of terrifying black hole, a specific place where women entered full of hope in search of a legitimate livelihood, but from which a completely disproportionate number never emerged, at least not visibly to the rest of society. The stark contrast between the noisy, cheerful bustle of the consumption room and the chilling, almost palpable silence surrounding these multiple disappearances created an utterly unbearable cognitive dissonance for the few individuals who were beginning to pay serious attention to the gruesome details. Joe Ball's perverse method for managing these repeated absences relied entirely on formidable psychological manipulation, demanding absolute and terrifying consistency in his daily lies. Faced with deeply anguished families, tearful mothers, or suspicious brothers who sometimes made the long journey to Elmendorf to demand clear answers, he never once relinquished his mask of courteous and polite indifference. He would receive them kindly at his establishment, sometimes even offering them drinks to calm them down, and tirelessly repeat the same fabricated stories, cruelly exploiting their profound despair and utter helplessness in the face of the glaring lack of physical evidence. The main strength of his deadly deception lay in the absolute and continuous absence of corpses, a sine qua non that effectively prevented local authorities, often reluctant to seriously investigate the disappearances of women wrongly considered marginal, from formally classifying these disturbing cases as proven murders. Without the presence of a physical body, there was technically no crime in the eyes of the law, and without a proven crime, Joe Ball remained a perfectly untouchable citizen, a successful businessman whose only apparent fault was employing a dramatically unstable staff. But the absolute truth, however deeply buried beneath a web of lies, has a natural and inevitable tendency to rise to the surface, and in the tragic case of the Sociable Inn, it began to manifest itself physically through sensory elements impossible for the local population to ignore. The alligator pool, that muddy, dark, and menacing pit strategically located at the rear of the building, which was the undisputed pride of the owner and the morbid delight of the drunken crowds, quickly became the epicenter of a growing and profoundly terrifying rumor. As the disappearances of women multiplied at an alarming rate, a nauseating, horribly thick, and sickly sweet stench began to rise insidiously from the reptile enclosure, aggressively seeping into the nostrils of patrons leaning against the bar and contaminating the stifling air of the Texas nights. This unbearable stench was not the familiar, harmless smell of stagnant mud or wild animal excrement, but rather the unmistakable and appalling odor of highly decomposing organic flesh. The public feedings, which had once drawn joyful and innocent cheers, now took on a nightmarish and unspeakable dimension in the terrified collective imagination. Regular patrons, who had once laughed heartily at the sight of abandoned dogs and stray cats being savagely torn apart by the powerful jaws of the 5 prehistoric predators, suddenly began to observe the murky water with chilling suspicion and mute terror. The terrifying rumor, initially whispered between sips of lukewarm beer to avoid attracting the owner's attention, quickly transformed into a dreadful open secret, silently shared throughout the town of Elmendorf. The terrified locals began to formulate the unthinkable hypothesis that the proprietor wasn't simply slaughtering these poor women in private, but was deliberately and cynically using the alligator pit as a personal slaughterhouse and a foolproof biological incinerator. According to this macabre theory, which spread like wildfire, the owner meticulously and methodically dismembered the bloodied bodies of his innocent victims away from prying eyes, knowingly transforming the mutilated human remains into abundant food for his scaly monsters in order to permanently and chemically erase any tangible evidence of his criminal involvement. This profoundly terrifying idea instantly transformed every rough scale, every stealthy reptilian movement in the muddy water into potential and devastating evidence of his unspeakable atrocities, imbuing the rural tavern with an atmosphere of pure, suffocating terror that contrasted sharply with its deceptively friendly name. The harsh Texas summers, universally known for their oppressive, stifling heat, played a particularly perverse role in this silent tragedy by cruelly exacerbating the sensory details of the presumed crime scene. The blazing sun beat down mercilessly on the stagnant, foul-smelling water of the pool, causing a sticky evaporation that faithfully carried the pestilential stench of death to the shaded porches of neighboring houses. The frightened residents of Elmendorf huddled anxiously in their homes, tightly closing their windows despite the oppressive heat wave, vainly trying to escape the overwhelming stench that constantly reminded them of the presence of absolute evil operating just steps away from their falsely peaceful daily lives. This constant olfactory agony was logically accompanied by an immense and destructive psychological burden for the silent witnesses of this dark era. Every regular at the tavern, every regular supplier who delivered barrels of fresh beer, every innocent passerby who happened to meet Joe Ball's cold, calculating gaze became, in a painful way, an accomplice by tragic omission to the unbearable horror that continued with impunity. The heavy silence of the community, directly dictated by the visceral fear of violent reprisals and the persistent disbelief in the face of the astronomical scale of the alleged acts, allowed the methodical murderer to continue his macabre harvest in apparent tranquility. Protective mothers now formally and strictly forbade their innocent children from approaching within 100 meters of the establishment, effectively transforming the sociable into a cursed den, a forbidden place central to local horror stories even before the regional police had filed a single official charge against the proprietor. The invisible suffering of the missing women's families, cruelly left in an absolute void without any corpses to mourn in their legitimate grief, was undoubtedly the most heartbreaking and inhumane aspect of this sordid affair. They were sadly condemned to live indefinitely in a state of permanent emotional purgatory, painfully torn between the slim, irrational hope that Joe Ball's carefully constructed lies might ultimately be true and the chilling, growing certainty that their beloved daughters, sisters, or friends had met an unspeakably horrific end in the merciless jaws of hungry predators or under the cold bullets of a murderous pistol. This toxic uncertainty slowly but surely gnawed at the souls of those left waiting, while the impassive executioner continued to pour overflowing glasses and meticulously tally his daily takings with monstrous indifference, demonstrating a deeply ingrained psychopathy and a complete disregard for human life. The gaping chasm between the bar's festive, illusory facade and the bloody, murderous reality of its backyard widened daily, creating a terrifying spatial and temporal anomaly where serial killing became as commonplace and routine as the daily cleaning of sticky countertops. The year 1938 finally marked the inevitable culmination of this unchecked killing spree, the precise moment when the intricate edifice of lies carefully constructed by Joe Ball began to crack under the crushing weight of his own criminal audacity. Among the countless potential victims tragically swallowed by the saloon's growing shadow, the dramatic case of Minnie Gotthard perfectly and cruelly illustrated the relentless brutality of the situation. This particular woman, whose connection to the proprietor was deeply personal and intimate, suddenly and completely ceased to exist for the rest of the waking world, tragically joining the long list of Elmendorf's nameless ghosts. Her shocking absence, quickly followed by other equally inexplicable disappearances, did much to deepen the surrounding mystery, but it was undoubtedly the subsequent disappearance of the young and radiant Hazel Brown that ultimately served as the powerful catalyst for the final collapse of this long reign of absolute terror. Unlike some of the previous victims whose distant families were isolated, vulnerable, or resigned to poverty, Hazel's sudden disappearance generated immediate shockwaves that extended far beyond the stifling, isolated confines of the small rural town. Her devoted circle, categorically refusing to swallow the usual platitudes and flimsy excuses arrogantly offered by the saloon owner, immediately began asking far more pointed questions and alerting the appropriate authorities with a ferocious insistence that Joe Ball had never before encountered in his criminal career. The police net was tightening slowly but surely around the dreaded alligator man. Regional law enforcement, until then strongly reluctant to interfere in the lucrative business of an influential local figure based solely on dubious popular rumors, suddenly found themselves compelled to act decisively in the face of the irrefutable accumulation of disturbing reports and the overwhelming enormity of the grim suspicions that hung heavily over the establishment. The incessant, terrified whispers concerning the persistent putrid stench of the pit and the statistically impossible series of female disappearances could no longer be ignored by the official authorities of San Antonio and the surrounding counties. The well-oiled machinery of the perfect crime, which relied entirely on the complete erasure of victims and cowardly social indifference, was undeniably malfunctioning irrevocably and fatally for its architect. Each feverishly passing day brought the fateful and inevitable moment ever closer, the moment when the determined investigators would cross the threshold of the sociable inn, not to carelessly sip a drink and cowardly ignore the macabre rumors, but to confront the unmasked predator directly and relentlessly in his own lair. Joe Ball's apparent calm, that chilling and haughty self-assurance he displayed publicly while mechanically cleaning his bar or theatrically feeding his voracious beasts, was now nothing more than an extremely fragile facade concealing a growing, simmering panic. He fully realized that his systematic elimination scheme, whether it involved the crushing jaws of his monstrous reptiles or the cowardly complicity of his terrified subordinates to bury the damning evidence of his cruelty, was undeniably about to be exposed under the glare of justice. The dramatic events unfolded with a tragic and lightning-fast inevitability, leading straight to a decisive and historic confrontation that would definitively seal the man's grim fate, brutally unveil the unspeakable horror hidden in the Texas soil, and tragically confirm the worst fears of those who had bravely dared to look beyond the festive facade of the Kirsten. The thick veil of mystery that shrouded the unspeakable atrocities of the sociable and was truly about to be violently torn away, releasing a truth so appalling that it would forever mark the region's criminal history and etch the infamous name of Joe Ball into the collective memory as the absolute and terrifying embodiment of evil concealed beneath the ordinary guise of the neighborhood. The dramatic transition from mere whispered suspicion to imminent police action marked the brutal end of impunity for the man who had cruelly played God with women's lives, orchestrating in the shadows a veritable massacre whose exact scale remained to be determined, buried under the menacing silence of his domain. The final confrontation that would determine the fate of the sociable in and shatter the illusion of impunity carefully cultivated by Joe Ball was brewing in an atmosphere of stifling tension during September 1938. For weeks, macabre rumors and persistent reports concerning the unexplained disappearance of young Hazel Brown had finally created an insurmountable breach in the wall of silence the saloon owner had erected around his criminal activities. Local authorities, driven by families increasingly determined to get answers and by the mounting suspicions surrounding the rural establishment in Elmendorf, could no longer turn a blind eye. The wheels of justice, slow to start turning due to geographical isolation and a critical lack of tangible evidence, had finally begun to move with chilling inevitability. On September 24, 1938, investigators decided to go directly to the sociable and to confront the prime suspect and take him to the police station for formal questioning about Hazel Brown's fate. It was in this familiar setting, steeped in an unhealthy heaviness and a persistent stench of decay and dust, that the tragic denouement of this dark affair unfolded. The detectives expected to encounter the same cold, self-possessed, and evasive individual who had, in the past, dismissed the concerns of his victims' loved ones with a mere shrug. However, the sudden arrival of law enforcement behind the saloon bar instantly shattered the veneer of absolute control that Joe Ball had striven to maintain for years. Aware that the net was closing in on him, that his scheme of lies and methodical eliminations had reached its limits, and categorically refusing to face the humiliation of a public trial, forced confessions, and the exposure of his monstrosities, the man known as the Butcher of Elmendorf committed a final, radical act. In a fraction of a second, before the stunned eyes of the bewildered police officers who had no time to anticipate his move, his hand slipped under the solid would counter to pull out not an accounting ledger or a bottle of comfort, but a loaded firearm. Without a word of explanation, without expressing the slightest regret or offering a single justification to the representatives of the law, Joe Ball pointed the barrel directly at his own heart and pulled the trigger. The brutal explosion echoed through the tavern's large, empty room, bringing an instant and definitive end to the life of the man who had silently terrorized the region. The proprietor's lifeless body collapsed onto the dusty floor, taking with him to the grave the exact secrets of all the other missing women, leaving behind an abyssal void and a legal enigma impossible to fully solve. The sudden and violent death of the prime suspect caused an immediate emotional and logistical earthquake within the local community and among the investigators, who found themselves overnight facing a wall of questions with no direct answers. The only man who held the complete map of the sociable in's atrocities was no longer there to testify, and the prospect of understanding the true extent of this serial killing seemed to vanish with the killer's last breath. However, Joe Ball's disappearance did not mean the investigation was definitively closed, for the visceral fear and panic that had gripped the subordinates who had been around him would soon unleash a torrent of words long stifled by the threat of bloody reprisals. Among these low-level figures, one man in particular, an employee and occasional accomplice named Clifford Wheeler, had been living for months in a state of absolute psychological terror, crushed by the weight of his involuntary or willing collaboration in the horrific acts perpetrated by his tyrannical employer. Joe Ball's shocking suicide acted as a liberating wake-up call for Wheeler, who understood with chilling clarity that he now stood alone in facing the criminal responsibility for the crimes committed in the shadows of the saloon. Haunted by the ghosts of the victims and rightly fearing he would be made the sole scapegoat for this bloody tragedy, Wheeler decided to turn himself into the authorities and confess everything, thus definitively breaking the pact of silence that had protected the macabre legacy of the butcher of Elmendorf. His confession, delivered with the trembling of fear and the uneasy relief of someone shedding an unbearable burden, would lead investigators to a very concrete physical and geographical reality, far removed from the fantastical rumors about the alligators in the basin. Clifford Wheeler guided the police away from the illusory bustle of the tavern, leading them along dusty trails to a particularly isolated, desolate, and silent area located in the immediate vicinity of the banks of the San Antonio River. It was in this stark natural setting, far from prying eyes and the curiosity of tourists, that the terrified accomplice pointed out a precise location to investigators, where the ground seemed to bear the scars of recent human intervention. Armed with shovels and accustomed to the worst horrors of their profession, the police began digging into the arid, compact Texas earth, guided by the fragmentary but precise directions of the man who had helped conceal the unthinkable. The blows of the shovels echoing in the heavy silence of the surrounding nature quickly unearthed irrefutable physical evidence, transforming abstract suspicions into chilling forensic certainty. The meticulous excavations, conducted under Wheeler's direction, unearthed the human remains of young Hazel Brown, whose disappearance had ignited the investigation just days earlier, confirming in the most tragic way possible the grim fate that had awaited her. Alongside Hazel's body, investigators also unearthed the remains of another woman identified as Minnie Gotthard, providing definitive physical evidence that the reported disappearances were not the result of simple voluntary runs away or spontaneous life changes, but rather the outcome of premeditated and cold-blooded homicides. Clifford Wheeler's statements during this gruesome reconstruction shed light on the murderer's true modus operandi, revealing that, contrary to the urban legend that was already beginning to spread throughout the region, Joe Ball had not necessarily used his alligators to kill his victims, but had preferred to employ more direct and conventional methods, using a firearm to coldly gun down women who, in his eyes, represented a threat, an obstacle, or a burden. Wheeler confirmed that he himself had been asked to assist in the clandestine burial of the two bodies by the river, acting under the psychological duress of an unpredictable and potentially lethal boss. The discovery of these secret graves validated the darkest aspects of the investigation, transforming a series of unsolved mysteries into a proven criminal case, while also highlighting the methodical cruelty with which the killer managed to dispose of his fellow citizens' bodies. However, while Wheeler's confession and the discovery of Hazel and Minnie's bodies offered a partial and tragic conclusion for these two families, they simultaneously left a vast and unsettling void regarding the fate of all the other women who had vanished over the years within the sociable's walls. The lists of waitresses, dancers, and intimate partners who had disappeared since the early 1930s contained dozens of names, and the lack of identified graves for these other victims maintained an unbearable veil of uncertainty over the true extent of Joe Ball's crimes. It was at this critical stage of the investigation that the mystery surrounding the infamous alligator pool regained its full significance in the minds of investigators and the local population, fueling persistent questions that the forensic science of the time simply could not hope to definitively resolve. The 5 giant reptiles that had been the tavern's main and macabre attraction were seized by the authorities and urgently transferred to the San Antonio Zoo, where they could be kept under strict control while experts investigated their potential involvement in the disappearance of the other missing bodies. Investigators strongly suspected that the muddy pool at the rear of the building had served as a biological disposal area, a living incinerator where the mutilated remains of some victims might have been discarded to be completely consumed by the aquatic predators, leaving no identifiable trace for future searchers. Unfortunately, given the absolute technological limitations of forensic science in the 1930s, it was entirely impossible to examine the animal's stomach contents or sift through the stagnant mud of the enclosure with the precision required to isolate microscopic human fragments or DNA evidence, which was non-existent at the time. This technical impasse condemned the alligator mystery to remain forever shrouded in ambiguity, constantly oscillating between the plausible reality of a perfect crime and the popular mythology inherent in major American true crime stories. The end of this judicial investigation, marked by the spectacular suicide of the main culprit and the belated but crucial confession of his accomplice, did not bring the lasting peace one might have hoped for the families of the forgotten victims, but it indelibly sealed the tragic fate of a place that has become a terrifying symbol of ordinary human violence pushed to its extreme. The legal conclusion of this terrifying case, marked by the violent death of its main protagonist and the disturbing revelations of his accomplice, ushered in a period of painful introspection and confrontation with reality for the small community of Elmendorf. As the courtroom doors and investigators' offices began compiling the factual elements of this macabre case, the question of responsibility and the legal framework that should govern the crimes committed arose with particular urgency. In a traditional justice system, a public trial is the fundamental stage where guilt is formally established, evidence is meticulously presented to a jury, and the convicted person faces the judgment of their peers. However, in the case of Joe Ball, the spectacular suicide on September 24, 1938, behind the counter of the sociable inn destroyed any possibility of him ever appearing in a courtroom to answer for his actions. The criminal had evaded human justice with a final, definitive decision, leaving behind a legal vacuum and immense frustration for the victims' families, who had fervently hoped to hear a public confession and understand the underlying motivations for these serial massacres. The death of the main defendant meant that public prosecution against him was extinguished, depriving the judicial system of the catharsis of a guilty verdict pronounced by a judge. Nevertheless, the judicial system could not simply file the case away in general indifference, as the extent of the suspicions and the physical discovery of the bodies near the San Antonio River demanded a formal closure and the rigorous establishment of secondary responsibilities. It was precisely within this context of procedural vacuum that the role of accomplice Clifford Wheeler became crucial to the functioning of the institutions. By turning himself into the authorities after his employer's suicide, Wheeler provided the justice system with the only available means to shed light on the investigation's shortcomings and legally validate the homicides. His detailed testimony, though given under the influence of fear and a desire to protect his own life from public outrage, was meticulously examined by prosecutors and investigators to determine the precise extent of his involvement in the crimes. Wheeler had to explain in detail how he had been compelled to assist Joe Ball, not as a direct co-perpetrator of the gun murders, but as an accomplice coerced and terrified by the saloon owner's psychological and physical dominance, forced to transport and clandestinely bury the bodies of Hazel Brown and Minnie Gotthard in the inhospitable Texas soil. The judicial authorities thus had to assess his legal situation pragmatically, recognizing that his belated cooperation was essential to understanding the modus operandi and returning the bodies to the grieving families, while maintaining the demand for accountability for his involvement in concealing corpses and obstructing the course of justice. The legal analysis at the time, confronted with such an atypical and sordid criminal scenario, highlighted the limitations of traditional criminal procedures when faced with a serial killer who chose to escape the ultimate judgment by taking his own life. The official investigation reports concluded by acknowledging Joe Ball's direct responsibility for the deaths of the women whose bodies could be formally exhumed and identified by forensic experts, while emphasizing the practical impossibility of definitively attributing the dozens of other unsolved disappearances to a formal charge due to the complete absence of usable human remains. This situation created a sense of incompleteness within the judicial system, a gaping chasm between the deep-seated conviction, firmly supported by persistent rumors, the partial confessions of the accomplice, and the overall picture of events, and the strict criteria of material evidence required by the courts of the time to legally define mass murder. The trial, had it been able to take place, would undoubtedly have allowed for a comprehensive examination of the moral and administrative responsibility of a community and local institutions that, through negligence, indifference, or fear, had allowed such a climate of impunity to flourish around a notorious public establishment. Instead, the proceedings closed with a declaration of death and the trial of the sole surviving accomplice, leaving a persistent shadow over the true scope of the affair. The criminal aspect of the investigation also highlighted the glaring shortcomings of the investigative techniques and forensic science of the 1930s, which proved utterly incapable of scientifically analyzing the contents of the alligator tank or exploiting the microscopic evidence that could have definitively confirmed or refuted the legend of the reptile massacre. For the magistrates and investigators of the time, the frustration was palpable, as they knew full well that the legal truth obtained was limited to the visible tip of a much larger criminal iceberg, the submerged portion of which remained forever protected by the mud of the enclosures and the final silence of the suicide victim. The closing of the cases, therefore, did not bring the complete peace one expects from justice served according to the rules of procedure, but it did officially mark the end of an investigation tainted by horror and anomaly. The victims' families, for their part, were confronted with a cold, institutional reality where the impossibility of holding proper trials for each missing woman deprived them of any form of public and solemn recognition of their suffering, too often relegating them to the status of mere figures forgotten in the margins of a sensational news story. The impact of this aborted legal conclusion left a lasting mark on the region, transforming the Joe Ball case into a prime subject of study for criminal historians and criminologists, who saw in it the perfect illustration of the dead ends encountered by the justice system when faced with criminals who escaped punishment by suicide and exploited the methodological flaws of their time. History thus froze not around a grand historical verdict pronounced by a judge under the gilded trappings of a courtroom, but around a solitary gunshot fired from behind a sticky counter, an abrupt epilogue that denied society the right to look the monster in the eye and demand accountability, leaving it to collective memory and the passage of time to bear the burden of a truth too heavy for the legal structures of a small rural Texas town. The true measure of a tragedy of this magnitude lies not in time-yellowed police reports, nor even in the ambiguous verdicts delivered in the haste of a bygone era, but rather in the lasting shockwaves it sends through the collective consciousness and the way it permanently reshapes the memory of an entire community. The Joe Ball case, forever frozen in the dark recesses of 1930s Texas criminal history, has, far beyond its bloody conclusion, transcended the boundaries of a mere news item to take deep root in the dark folklore of the United States, gradually mutating from a morbid reality into a persistent and chilling urban legend. This semantic and cultural shift is not insignificant, for it illustrates how the human mind, confronted with horrors that are difficult to conceive and institutional blind spots that it cannot rationally illuminate, tends to cloak historical truth in a mythological aura to better cope with the violence of the initial trauma. The character of Joe Ball, the seemingly ordinary saloon owner who concealed a methodical predator's nature behind a merchant's smile and a facade of feigned conviviality, has thus been transformed in the popular imagination into an archetypal figure of the modern bogeyman, a solitary monster prowling in the dust of forgotten towns in the southern United States. The physical presence of those 5 live alligators, lumbering heavily in the muddy, stagnant water of the Sociable Inn's back enclosure, provided the perfect iconographic element to fuel this terrifying mythology, transforming a macabre entertainment device into a universal symbol of total annihilation and absolute impunity in the face of human justice. It is precisely this powerful and macabre imagery that, decades later, inspired artistic and cinematic creation, finding its most striking echo in the independent horror films of the 1970s with iconic works like Tobe Hooper's Eaten Alive, which drew directly from the Elmendorf legend to transpose onto the screen the visceral terror of a man feeding his victims to his fearsome reptiles. However, while cinema and popular folklore have largely capitalized on the sensational and spectacular nature of the alligator fable to entertain crowds seeking safe thrills, This excessive folklorization carries a perverse and profoundly unjust risk, that of gradually erasing the fragile and tragic human reality of the real victims who lost their lives in this turmoil. Behind the tales of scaly monsters and the legends of haunted taverns were real women, beings of flesh and blood, precarious workers of the Great Depression, waitresses and dancers who struggled daily to survive in a hostile world and who, at the end of their journey, found only a violent and anonymous end orchestrated by a predator devoid of even a shred of empathy. Figures like Hazel Brown and Minnie Gotthard, whose bodies exhumed near the banks of the San Antonio River shattered the silence of complicity, should not be relegated to mere narrative devices or footnotes in a macabre crime biography. They embody the tragic vulnerability of an entire social class ignored by the protective structures of their time. Women whose disappearance initially elicited only cynical indifference before becoming the catalyst for a legal shockwave. The memory of these victims constitutes the fundamental ethical issue at stake in any serious retrospective on this case, reminding us with poignant clarity that the true horror lies not in the mythical presence of wild animals, but rather in the cold, calculated, and banal cruelty of a human being who considered the lives of others as disposable material at his own convenience. The in-depth examination of this criminal trajectory also offers a valuable sociological and historical perspective on the condition of women and the configuration of isolated rural communities during the post-Prohibition period, highlighting how geographical isolation, combined with widespread economic distress and deeply ingrained sexist prejudices in the mentalities of the time, could create an ideal hunting ground for a serial killer operating in broad daylight. Coball skillfully exploited the systemic flaws in his environment, capitalizing on the fact that the society of his time was naturally inclined to ignore the plight of marginalized women, those saloon workers deemed unworthy of rigorous attention from the authorities or sustained compassion from public opinion. His repeated lies, delivered with Olympian calm and disconcerting confidence in the face of grieving families, worked precisely because they relied on tolerated cultural stereotypes, according to which a woman leaving a lowly job to flee to a distant big city warranted neither thorough investigation nor undue concern. By shattering this veneer of normality, the tragic collapse of the sociable in September 1938 forced the Elmendorf community, and by extension, the whole of American society, to confront its own blind spots, to painfully acknowledge that absolute evil does not necessarily bear the grotesque features of a legendary creature, but can very well don the innocuous guise of a smiling local shopkeeper, serving cold drinks behind a wooden counter, while death lurks just a few steps away, amid general indifference. The contemporary resonance of the Joe Ball case lies precisely in this capacity to question our own relationship to vigilance, empathy, and the protection of the most vulnerable, reminding us that the lessons of the past demand that we never underestimate warning signs, never normalize violence simply because it occurs outside the spheres of conventional respectability, and steadfastly refuse to allow oblivion to erase the dignity of those who suffered in silence. As time continues to smooth the contours of this story, transforming the established facts into a distant historical echo muffled by the sands of Texas, the duty to remember remains the only effective bulwark against the trivialization of evil, ensuring that the names of Hazel Brown, Minnie Gotthard, and all those anonymous figures who vanished in the shadows of the saloon continue to resonate not as mere macabre curiosities for lovers of scary tales, but as the painful memorial of a human tragedy that no folklore will ever be able to completely erase, leaving forever the indelible mark of their shattered passage on the silent banks of the San Antonio River and in the critical conscience of all humanity. As the dust settles over the desolate landscape of Elmendorf, Texas, and the decades continue to distance the modern world from the grim realities of 1938, the legacy of Joe Ball endures not merely as a localized historical anomaly, but as a profound psychological study into the darker facets of human nature. The evolution of the sociable from a vibrant, post-Prohibition hub of rural socialization into a quiet monument of terror reveals how easily a community can become an unwitting accomplice to horror through collective silence, willful ignorance, and the comforting illusion of distance. When we strip away the sensationalized layers of urban folklore, the cinematic adaptations, and the grotesque mythology of the alligator pit, we are left with a stark, sobering truth about the vulnerability of human existence during times of economic and social upheaval. The Great Depression had already fractured the social fabric, leaving countless individuals rootless, desperate, and adrift in a world where survival often superseded safety. In this fragile ecosystem, predators like Joe Ball found fertile ground, operating in plain sight by exploiting the systemic indifference directed toward society's most precarious populations. The young women who stepped through the doors of the sociable Inn as waitresses, dancers, or romantic partners were not seeking out tragedy. They were simply trying to navigate a harsh economic climate, seeking dignity, independence, and a meager livelihood. Yet, they walked into an environment where power dynamics were steeply skewed in favor of a charismatic, controlling proprietor who utilized spectacle to blind his patrons to the rot festering just beyond the back wall. The public display of feeding live animals to the 5 alligators served a dual purpose that went far beyond mere entertainment. It was an active conditioning tool, a visceral demonstration of dominance that normalized brutality and communicated an unmistakable, silent warning to anyone who dared question the authority of the tavern's master. This theatrical display of prehistoric violence effectively deadened the moral sensibilities of the clientele, replacing empathy with morbid curiosity and transforming the courtyard into an amphitheater of cruelty, where the line between animal carnage and human atrocities blurred into insignificance. It is a chilling reminder of how human societies can become desensitized to violence when it is packaged as entertainment or normalized within the daily routine of a community. The psychological burden carried by the residents of Elmendorf who suspected the truth, yet chose to look the other way, highlights the insidious nature of fear and conformity. To speak out against a prominent local business owner in a small, isolated town required a degree of courage that few possessed, especially when weighed against the absence of concrete proof and the comforting efficiency of Joe Ball's plausible lies. The calm, unshakable demeanor with which the proprietor deflected inquiries about missing women stands as a masterclass in sociopathic manipulation, weaponizing the transient nature of tavern employment against the very people who held it. He understood that society was already primed to believe the worst of women who worked in saloons during that era, viewing them as inherently unstable or prone to sudden, unannounced departures. By leveraging these deep-seated cultural prejudices, Joe Ball constructed an impenetrable shield of plausible deniability that protected his crimes for years, allowing him to continue his murderous routine while the townspeople swallowed their suspicions along with their cold drinks. The unraveling of this macabre empire in September of 1938 did not come as a triumph of modern investigative policing or advanced forensic science, but rather as a violent, abrupt implosion triggered by the persistent courage of a grieving family and the sudden, cowardly escape of the killer through a self-inflicted gunshot. That final, echoing blast behind the wooden counter of the sociable ineffectively slammed the door on true accountability, denying the victims and their loved ones the catharsis of a public trial, the formality of a legal verdict, and the complete disclosure of the full extent of his depravity. The suicide was the ultimate act of control by a man who refused to surrender his autonomy to the justice system, leaving the state with fragments of a horrifying puzzle that could never be fully assembled. The confession and cooperation of Clifford Wheeler provided a crucial anchor of physical reality, leading investigators to the desolate riverbanks where the silent earth yielded the broken bodies of Hazel Brown and Minnie Gotthard, transforming abstract rumors into undeniable forensic fact. Yet, the recovery of these 2 victims only served to underscore the terrifying ambiguity surrounding the dozens of other women whose names remain absent from official records, their ultimate fates swallowed forever by the muddy waters of the alligator enclosure or buried beneath the sun-baked soil of South Texas. The limitations of 1930s forensic technology left the mystery of the reptiles an eternal enigma, preventing science from confirming whether the beasts had truly acted as biological incinerators for human remains. This permanent gap between suspicion and verification is precisely what allowed the case to transcend criminal history and cross over into the realm of dark American folklore. The story morphed into a cautionary tale told across generations, a local ghost story that eventually bled into popular culture, most notably inspiring cinematic depictions of rural terror. However, in our fascination with the cinematic monsters and the sensationalism of the alligator man, we bear the ethical responsibility of never losing sight of the human cost at the heart of the narrative. The true horror of the Elmendorf tragedy is not found in the scales and teeth of apex predators, but in the calculated, cold-blooded actions of an ordinary man who viewed human lives as disposable commodities. The legacy of these events challenges us to examine our own contemporary structures of vigilance and empathy, reminding us of the critical importance of listening to the marginalized, questioning the comfortable lies told by those in power, and refusing to let institutional apathy allow vulnerable individuals to vanish into the shadows unnoticed. The silent banks of the San Antonio River and the dusty, quiet streets of Elmendorf remain as quiet witnesses to a dark chapter of history where the monsters did not wear masks or hide in the wilderness, but instead stood behind saloon counters, poured drinks, and smiled warmly at the crowds who cheered for their destruction, leaving behind a haunting, enduring testament to the depths of human cruelty and the enduring obligation of society to remember those who were unjustly erased from the world. As we draw the final curtain on this dark chapter of American true crime history, looking back across the decades that separate us from the blistering and unforgiving heat of 1938 Texas, it becomes increasingly clear that the story of Joe Ball and the sociable is not merely a localized anomaly of rural deviance, but a profound and disturbing mirror reflecting the fragility of human society during times of profound systemic stress and economic ruin. The small and dusty town of Elmendorf forever bears the invisible scars of a nightmare that unfolded in plain sight, masterfully masked by the mundane rhythms of daily life, post-prohibition celebration, and the desperate pursuit of survival during the darkest and most punishing days of the Great Depression. When we deconstruct the layers of myth, folklore, and cinematic sensationalism that have accumulated around the figure of the Elmendorf butcher over the past century, we are ultimately forced to confront a much more sober and harrowing reality, one defined not by mythical monsters lurking in murky water, but by the chilling and calculated capacity of an ordinary human being to treat vulnerable lives as entirely disposable commodities for his own amusement and convenience. The true horror of what transpired behind the tavern doors does not reside in the sharp teeth and powerful jaws of the 5 captive alligators, however terrifying that imagery may be to the human imagination, but rather in the cold, methodical, and indifferent actions of a man who weaponized the social prejudices, the economic desperation, and the systemic blind spots of his era to commit acts of unspeakable cruelty without ever losing his outward composure or facing immediate accountability. Throughout this deep and unflinching exploration into the dark underbelly of South Texas history, we have witnessed how the architecture of a crime of this magnitude is built stone by stone upon foundations of widespread indifference and dangerous isolation. The young women who found themselves drawn into the orbit of Joe Ball, whether as waitresses serving drinks to rowdy crowds of thirsty patrons, as dancers maintaining the festive illusion of the saloon, or as intimate partners sharing a domestic space with a violently unpredictable predator, were trapped in a complex web of structural vulnerability. They were independent individuals striving against insurmountable and punishing odds to secure a meager livelihood in an economy that offered precious few protections, safety nets, or professional opportunities for working-class women trying to navigate a harsh world. Their presence in a rural Texas saloon placed them precariously on the absolute margins of societal respectability, an ambiguous social standing that Joe Ball manipulated with calculated and predatory precision. He understood with an instinctive and sinister cunning that the transient nature of tavern employment and the widespread cultural prejudices of the 1930s would work directly in his favor should anyone ever dare to inquire about their sudden and inexplicable disappearances from the premises. When anxious families, worried siblings, or concerned friends crossed the threshold of the sociable in seeking definitive answers, they were met not with hostility, defensive panic, or evasion, but with a wall of practiced and unshakable calm. The smooth and rehearsed explanations delivered effortlessly from behind the wooden counter, the casual dismissal of a missing woman as someone who had simply grown tired of small-town life, boarded a bus for a larger city, or eloped into the night with a sudden lover, exploited the exact cultural biases that rendered these vulnerable women invisible to the broader apparatus of law enforcement and social justice. The psychological manipulation that sustained this macabre empire for years relied entirely on the absence of physical evidence and the stifling complicity born of fear and social conformity. In a small and close-knit rural community where economic survival depended heavily on local power dynamics and where the presence of a prominent and domineering businessman cast a long and intimidating shadow, speaking out against the proprietor of the sociable required a degree of moral courage that very few residents possessed. The community chose the path of least resistance, swallowing their growing suspicions and rationalizing the foul and overwhelming stench of decaying organic matter that drifted persistently from the alligator enclosure during the suffocating and unbearable heat of the summer months. They allowed the spectacle of live animal feedings, the theatrical and public tossing of stray dogs, cats, and chickens into the churning water before cheering crowds of inebriated onlookers, to serve as a grotesque distraction, a daily normalization of violence that deadened their moral sensitivities and conditioned them to view cruelty as a form of casual and acceptable entertainment. This systematic normalization of brutality created an impenetrable psychological barrier, shielding the true and darker horrors happening behind closed doors from the public scrutiny they so desperately deserved. Yet, beneath the veneer of festive normalcy and the morbid fascination with the alligators, a quiet tragedy was unfolding, leaving behind a trail of broken families trapped in a perpetual state of emotional purgatory, condemned to mourn loved ones whose bodies had been systematically erased from the earth without a trace. The dramatic unraveling of this long-standing reign of terror in September of 1938 marked a violent and abrupt collision between illusion and grim reality. When the authorities finally stepped behind the counter of the sociable to question Joe Ball regarding the disappearance of young Hazel Brown, the illusion of untouchable control shattered in a single defining instant. Rather than facing the consequences of his actions in a court of law, the Elmendorf butcher chose a cowardly and definitive escape, utilizing a concealed firearm to end his own life before a stunned and helpless audience of law enforcement officers. That single gunshot, echoing violently through the empty and smoke-stained tavern, forever silenced the only person who held the complete and unvarnished truth of how many lives had been extinguished within his domain. By taking his own life, Joe Ball denied the victims, their grieving families, and the wider public the essential catharsis of a formal trial, a definitive legal verdict, and a full public accounting of his monstrous deeds. He left behind a fractured puzzle of missing persons files, unverified rumors, and a lingering shadow of doubt that no amount of subsequent investigation could ever fully dispel, locking his secrets away in the permanent silence of death. The ensuing confession and cooperation of Clifford Wheeler provided a vital anchor of forensic reality, piercing through the dense fog of urban legend to establish undeniable proof of murder. By leading investigators to the desolate and isolated riverbanks near the San Antonio River, Wheeler transformed whispered rumors into cold and hard facts. The excavation of the shallow graves yielding the tragic remains of Hazel Brown and Minnie Gotthard offered a vital and definitive closure for those two specific families, while simultaneously confirming that Joe Ball had indeed relied on direct and violent execution rather than his captive reptiles for these particular homicides. Yet, even as these bodies were brought to the light of day, the discovery served to highlight the staggering gulf of uncertainty surrounding the fate of the remaining dozen or more women who had vanished into the vacuum of the sociable over the years. The limitations of 1930s forensic science meant that the mystery of the alligators could never be scientifically resolved, leaving the question of whether the reptiles served as biological incinerators forever locked in the realm of unprovable folklore. This permanent ambiguity is precisely what cemented the case in the annals of dark American mythology, transforming a series of horrific real-world crimes into a cautionary tale that would echo down through generations and inspire decades of cinematic explorations into rural terror. As we reflect upon the enduring legacy of the Elmendorf butcher, our primary ethical obligation remains firmly anchored in the preservation of human dignity for those who were so cruelly silenced. It is entirely too easy for history to become seduced by the sensationalism of the narrative, to focus solely on the menacing presence of the alligators, the dramatic finality of the suicide, and the chilling elements of a classic true crime mystery, while letting the actual human beings fade into the background as nameless statistics. But Hazel Brown, Minnie Gotthard, and all the other forgotten women who walked into the sociable in seeking a livelihood were daughters, sisters, friends, and individuals with full and unwritten futures that were brutally stolen from them by a predator who viewed their existence as utterly worthless. Their stories demand to be remembered not as mere entertainment or campfire ghost stories, but as solemn reminders of the profound vulnerabilities that accompany economic desperation, social marginalization, and institutional apathy. They stand as testaments to the critical necessity of a vigilant society, one that refuses to look away when warning signs emerge, that listens intently to the voices of the marginalized, and that holds accountable those who abuse their power under the cover of outward respectability. The quiet and dusty streets of Elmendorf and the silent, flowing waters of the San Antonio River continue to hold the quiet and enduring witness of a dark chapter that can never be entirely undone. The passing of time may soften the sharp edges of the initial terror, turning historical fact into distant lore, but the underlying lessons of the case remain urgently relevant to our modern understanding of human behavior, criminal psychology, and collective responsibility. We are reminded that monsters do not always wear disguises or hide in the untamed wilderness. Sometimes, they stand openly behind community counters, pouring drinks, sharing smiles, and participating seamlessly in the rhythms of daily life, while hiding unfathomable darkness just beneath the surface. By honoring the memory of the victims, by stripping away the sensational myths to confront the stark realities of gender-based violence and societal indifference, and by maintaining an unwavering commitment to truth and empathy, we ensure that their lives are never truly forgotten. The legacy of the Elmendorf case challenges us to remain eternally vigilant, to question the comfortable lies told by those who wield control, and to ensure that no human being is ever allowed to slip silently into the shadows unnoticed, leaving behind an enduring beacon of remembrance that shines a persistent light into the darkest corners of human history. As the landscape of South Texas continues to shift beneath the relentless expansion of time and modernity, the physical traces of the past are gradually swallowed by the relentless advance of the natural world. The dusty crossroads of Elmendorf, once a bustling and tense focal point of post-prohibition desperation and quiet terror, have faded into a sleepy, unassuming corner of the broader landscape, where few casual travelers passing through would ever suspect the horrific secrets buried deep within the regional memory. Buildings crumble, wooden floorboards rot away, and the dusty earth reclaims the spaces where human drama, deception, and violence once played out under the harsh glare of the summer sun. Yet, despite the physical erosion of the structures that once housed the sociable inn and its infamous alligator pit, the psychological and cultural footprint of the events of 1938 remains remarkably resilient, lingering like a persistent ghost story whispered across generations. It is a testament to the fact that true historical trauma does not simply dissipate with the passing of decades. Rather, it settles into the collective consciousness of a community, transforming physical geography into a living monument of caution, sorrow, and unresolved mystery. The passing of time tends to soften the sharp edges of horror, dressing up brutal reality in the comfortable garments of folklore and urban legend. Yet beneath the layers of narrative embellishment lies a sobering anchor of historical fact that demands our persistent attention and unwavering respect. When we examine the broader context of Behar County and the wider expanse of Texas history during the interwar period, the case of Joe Ball emerges not as an isolated anomaly of a twisted mind operating in a vacuum, but as a deeply disturbing symptom of a society grappling with systemic instability. The economic ruin of the Great Depression had fundamentally altered the social contract, creating a vast underclass of transient workers, vulnerable individuals, and marginalized women who found themselves adrift in a hostile environment where basic survival overshadowed all else. In this fragile and unstable ecosystem, predators who understood how to manipulate social vulnerabilities could operate with a terrifying degree of impunity. Joe Ball did not need to invent an elaborate criminal network or construct a subterranean labyrinth to hide his actions. He simply relied on the profound institutional indifference that already characterized how society viewed working-class women laboring in rural saloons. The systemic failure to protect these individuals, combined with the cultural tendency to look the other way when the inconveniently vulnerable vanished from the landscape, created an environment where predatory behavior could thrive unchecked behind a facade of ordinary community commerce. This historical reality forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how institutional structures and social prejudices can inadvertently collaborate with evil, offering a protective shield of plausible deniability to those who choose to exploit the defenseless for their own personal gratification or convenience. The enduring fascination that true crime holds for the modern audience stems from a deep, psychological compulsion to understand the mechanics of darkness, to gaze into the abyss of human cruelty, and attempt to find a coherent pattern within the incomprehensible. When we immerse ourselves in narratives like the one that unfolded at the Sociable Inn, we are searching for signs, warnings, and markers that might help us identify the predators walking among us before it is too late. Yet, the tragedy of Elmendorf serves as a stark reminder that the monsters of our world rarely were the terrifying visages of folklore. Instead, they were the familiar faces of local merchants, community figures, and smiling hosts who pour our drinks, engage in polite conversation, and participate seamlessly in the rhythms of everyday life. This realization induces a profound sense of unease, shattering the comforting illusion that evil is always distinct, recognizable, and easily avoidable. The horror of Joe Ball lies precisely in his terrifying ordinariness, in the seamless way he transitioned from a charming purveyor of post-prohibition entertainment to a cold-blooded executioner, maintaining an unshakable facade of calm while carrying out unspeakable acts just beyond the view of his unsuspecting patrons. It challenges our fundamental assumptions about human nature and forces us to acknowledge that the capacity for extreme cruelty can exist comfortably alongside the mundane routines of civilization, hidden entirely in plain sight. In our ongoing quest to chronicle and understand these dark historical episodes, we bear an immense ethical responsibility to ensure that the narrative remains firmly anchored in the dignity of the victims rather than sliding entirely into the realm of sensationalized entertainment. It is remarkably easy for the human mind to become captivated by the grotesque elements of a story, fixating obsessively on the menacing presence of the alligators, the dramatic theater of the public animal feedings, and the cinematic finality of the suicide behind the wooden counter. However, when we allow the sensationalism to eclipse the human reality, we participate in a secondary erasure of the women whose lives were so violently stolen and whose futures were systematically extinguished. Hazel Brown, Minnie Gotthard, and the numerous other unnamed waitresses, dancers, and companions who vanished into the vacuum of the sociable and were daughters, sisters, friends, and individuals with profound human value that extended far beyond their precarious employment in a rural saloon. Their stories deserve to be remembered not as mere plot points in a campfire ghost story, but as solemn reminders of the devastating consequences of societal indifference and the urgent necessity of protecting the vulnerable from the predatory individuals who seek to exploit their isolation. By honoring their memory with sobriety, empathy, and uncompromising historical accuracy, we push back against the tide of oblivion that nearly consumed them, restoring their humanity and ensuring that their tragic fates are never reduced to mere amusement. The natural landscape of South Texas, with its vast horizons, oppressive summer heat, and silent, flowing rivers, serves as an eternal and indifferent witness to the human dramas played out upon its surface. The San Antonio River, moving sluggishly past the desolate banks where the shallow graves of Hazel and Minnie were eventually uncovered, continues its ancient course regardless of the historical traumas inscribed into the soil beside it. Nature does not moralize, nor does it preserve the memory of human wickedness with intentionality. It simply absorbs, erodes, and covers over the scars left by our collective history. This serene indifference of the natural world stands in sharp contrast to the turbulent, complex, and often painful efforts of human society to reckon with its own dark past. While forensic science in 1938 was severely limited, unable to unlock the permanent mysteries of the murky alligator enclosure or to provide definitive answers for the full scope of the missing persons files, the passage of time has allowed historians and true crime chroniclers to piece together the broader architectural framework of the tragedy. Yet, despite all our modern analytical tools, archival research, and psychological insights, certain truths remain permanently submerged beneath the muddy waters of history, locked away forever by the abrupt and cowardly self-inflicted gunshot that ended Joe Ball's life before he could face the full measure of human accountability. The psychological burden carried by the small community of Elmendorf in the wake of the 1938 revelations offers a compelling lesson in the corrosive nature of collective guilt and unspoken complicity. For years, the residents lived with the accumulating weight of unsettling rumors, foul odors drifting from the courtyard, and a statistical impossibility of vanishing women, choosing silence over confrontation out of fear, isolation, and a deep-seated distrust of outside intervention. When the illusion finally shattered with the suicide of the proprietor and the subsequent confessions of his terrified accomplice, the community was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality of their own passive participation in an environment that allowed a predator to operate unhindered. This phenomenon of collective looking the other way is not unique to rural Texas in the 1930s. It is a recurring pattern throughout human history, demonstrating how easily fear and the desire for social harmony can be weaponized to suppress dissent and normalize the abnormal. The legacy of the Elmendorf butcher challenges us to examine our own contemporary communities, urging us to remain vigilant against the subtle signs of abuse, to listen intently when the marginalized express fear, and to cultivate a culture of active moral courage that refuses to sacrifice human life on the altar of polite silence and willful ignorance. As we bring this deep exploration of the Joe Ball case to its comprehensive conclusion, we are left to ponder the delicate and complex relationship between historical fact, collective memory, and the enduring human desire for justice. The story of the Elmendorf butcher transcends its local origins to become a universal parable about the fragility of civilization, the hidden depths of human depravity, and the eternal obligation of society to remember those who were unjustly erased from the world. We have journeyed through the dust and heat of post-Prohibition Texas, navigated the murky waters of urban folklore, examined the harsh economic realities of the Great Depression, and confronted the chilling banality of evil embodied by a man who poured drinks with a smile while orchestrating unimaginable horrors in the background. While the full extent of his crimes may never be mathematically quantified, and while the mysterious depths of the alligator pit will forever guard its silent secrets against the inquiries of science, the core truth of the tragedy remains profoundly clear and unshakable. It is a truth rooted in the recovered names of Hazel Brown and Minnie Gotthard, in the quiet sorrow of grieving families denied true closure, and in the solemn responsibility of the living to ensure that the vulnerable are never again abandoned to the shadows of institutional indifference. The final echoes of the gunshot that silenced Joe Ball behind the wooden counter of the sociable and continue to reverberate across the decades, marking the definitive end of a dark chapter that will forever haunt the annals of American true crime. Yet, as the historical dust settles permanently over the quiet streets of Elmendorf and the flowing waters of the San Antonio River, the true legacy we choose to carry forward is not one of morbid fascination with monsters, but of profound and enduring empathy for the victims who deserved so much better from the world they inhabited. We leave behind the dusty saloon, the churning muddy water of the enclosure, and the chilling echoes of a terrifying past, carrying with us the vital reminder that vigilance, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to truth are our strongest shields against the darkness that occasionally threatens to consume the fragile boundaries of human decency. The story of the Elmendorf butcher is closed, its files archived in the vast library of human history, but the solemn obligation to remember, to question, and to protect remains eternally alive, guiding our steps forward through the uncertain shadows of the world we share. As we reach the final horizon of this extensive and harrowing journey into the darkest recesses of American true crime history, we are compelled to step back and look at the vast, sweeping landscape of what has been uncovered, examined, and mourned. The story of Joe Ball, the so-called alligator man of Elmendorf, is not merely a localized chronicle of rural deviance or a sensationalized campfire ghost story designed to quicken the pulse on a dark night. Rather, it stands as a monumental and sobering testament to the fragile boundaries of human civilization, the terrifying banality of calculated evil, and the heavy, enduring cost of collective societal indifference. Over the course of our exploration, we have traveled across the scorched and dusty plains of 1930s Texas, navigating the oppressive heat of the post-Prohibition era, the deep economic scars of the Great Depression, and the claustrophobic social dynamics of a small town caught in the grip of unacknowledged terror. We have peered behind the wooden counters of the sociable inn, traced the murky and menacing depths of the alligator enclosure, and stood in quiet, sorrowful contemplation upon the silent, sun-baked riverbanks where the broken bodies of Hazel Brown and Minnie Gotthard were finally unearthed from their clandestine graves. Yet, even as we draw the final curtain on this comprehensive narrative, we are acutely aware that the most profound dimensions of this tragedy cannot be neatly quantified by historical data, forensic evidence, or legal verdicts alone. They reside instead in the quiet, lingering echoes of a profound human sorrow that continues to haunt the collective conscience of anyone willing to look past the sensational myths and confront the stark, unfiltered reality of a predator who operated in plain sight. The enduring power of true crime storytelling lies not in the morbid fascination with gore or the cinematic theatrics of sudden violence, but in our collective, relentless compulsion to seek meaning within the chaotic and incomprehensible fragments of human cruelty. When we strip away the layers of urban folklore that have accumulated around the figure of the Elmendorf butcher over the past century, transforming a real-world monster into a larger-than-life bogeyman of popular culture, we are forced to grapple with a truth that is far more unsettling and difficult to digest. The true horror of the sociable inn does not spring from the prehistoric jaws of the 5 captive alligators or from the dramatic, self-inflicted gunshot that abruptly ended Joe Ball's life before he could face a public trial. Rather, it springs from the terrifying ordinariness of a man who weaponized the structural vulnerabilities, the social isolation, and the institutional prejudices of his time to systematically erase human lives without ever losing his outward composure. Joe Ball was a reflection of a deeply flawed system, a predator who recognized that the world around him was already predisposed to look away from working-class women laboring on the absolute margins of societal respectability. He understood that a waitress or a dancer in a rural saloon was someone whose sudden disappearance could be easily explained away by a casual lie, a convenient fabrication about a sudden bus ride to a distant city or an unannounced elopement with a passing lover. His genius, if it can be called that, was not found in a complex criminal intellect, but in his chilling exploitation of the profound apathy that characterized how society viewed those who lacked economic power, familial protection, and social standing. This realization forces us to confront our own contemporary responsibilities, reminding us that the conditions which allowed the Elmendorf butcher to thrive unchecked for years are not entirely unique to the historical context of the 1930s. Whenever a society permits economic desperation to marginalize vulnerable populations, whenever institutional structures fail to protect those who labor in precarious conditions, and whenever collective silence replaces active moral courage in the face of warning signs, the door is left wide open for predators to operate with virtual impunity. The residents of Elmendorf who lived through those tense and suffocating years carried an immense, corrosive burden of unspoken complicity, trapped between the suffocating grip of fear and the paralyzing absence of concrete proof. Their choice to look the other way, to rationalize the foul and putrid odors drifting from the courtyard, and to accept the smooth, rehearsed falsehoods offered across the saloon counter serves as a timeless warning about the dangerous seduction of conformity. It demonstrates how easily a community can become an unwitting accomplice to horror, not through active malice, but through the quiet, insidious erosion of vigilance and the desperate desire to maintain a fragile, artificial peace in the face of mounting indicators of danger. The legacy of this case challenges us to cultivate a culture of active empathy, one that refuses to normalize cruelty, that listens intently when the marginalized express fear, and that demands accountability from those who wield power and influence under the cover of outward respectability. As we honor the memory of those who are lost, our commitment must remain resolutely fixed on the preservation of human dignity. History is all too often seduced by the sensational, allowing the actual human beings at the center of a tragedy to fade into the background as nameless statistics, while the monsters take center stage in our folklore. But Hazel Brown, Minnie Gotthard, and the countless other unnamed women who walked into the sociable in seeking nothing more than an honest livelihood and a measure of independence were individuals with rich, complex lives, deep aspirations, and futures that were brutally and unjustly stolen from them. They were daughters, sisters, friends, and human beings whose intrinsic worth far transcended the precarious nature of their employment in a rural Texas tavern. By ensuring that their stories are told with sobriety, respect, and unwavering historical accuracy, we push back against the tide of oblivion that nearly consumed them, restoring their humanity and ensuring that their tragic fates serve as an enduring beacon of remembrance rather than a mere source of dark entertainment. Their memory demands that we remain eternally vigilant, that we question the comfortable lies told by those who seek to control us, and that we ensure no human being is ever allowed to slip silently into the shadows unnoticed. The natural landscape of South Texas, with its vast horizons, oppressive summer heat, and the slow, indifferent current of the San Antonio River, remains as an eternal witness to the human dramas played out upon its surface. The earth does not preserve our moral triumphs or our darkest wickednesses with intentionality. It simply absorbs, erodes, and covers over the scars we leave behind, indifferent to our pain and our remorse. Yet, while the physical environment reclaims the spaces where the sociable once stood, and while the passage of time softens the sharp edges of the historical record, the intellectual and moral lessons of the Joe Ball case remain permanently etched into the consciousness of true crime history. We leave behind the dusty crossroads, the murky waters of the alligator enclosure, and the chilling echoes of a terrifying past, carrying with us the profound realization that the defense of human decency requires constant vigilance, unwavering compassion, and an absolute refusal to let the darkness triumph over the light of truth. As the final echoes of this narrative fade into the quiet silence of history, we are left with the solemn responsibility to remember, to question, and to protect, ensuring that the forgotten women of Elmendorf are never truly lost to the darkness, but are instead forever illuminated by our enduring commitment to justice, empathy, and remembrance. As we navigate the twilight of our comprehensive exploration into the dark and disturbing history of Joe Ball and his notorious Elmendorf establishment, we find ourselves standing at a profound intersection between historical archiving and the enduring human impulse to seek meaning within tragedy. The passage of time does not merely erase the physical structures of the past, it transforms them into repositories of collective memory, places where the echoes of human choices, both noble and monstrous, linger long after the last witness has departed from the dusty crossroads. When we look back across the decades that separate our modern era from the scorching September heat of 1938, we are struck by how easily the sharp edges of real-world suffering can become softened by the gentle mist of folklore, turning a grim sequence of calculated murders into a captivating campfire tale told to shock casual listeners. Yet, true historical responsibility requires us to resist the temptation to let these events dissolve entirely into myth. It compels us to peel back the layers of sensationalism, cinematic adaptation, and urban legend to confront the stark, unvarnished human reality that rests at the absolute core of the narrative. The story of the Elmendorf butcher is not a ghost story meant to frighten children in the dark. It is a solemn historical account of real women whose lives were abruptly cut short by a predator who manipulated the systemic vulnerabilities of his time to inflict unimaginable pain without ever facing the true measure of worldly accountability. The architecture of true crime investigation relies heavily on the physical preservation of records, the painstaking collection of forensic traces, and the courage of individuals who are willing to break the protective seals of silence that shroud dark deeds. In the case of the Sociable Inn, the investigation was forever compromised by the combination of 1930s technological limitations and the abrupt, cowardly suicide of the perpetrator behind the wooden counter. Because Joe Ball chose to end his own life before a public trial could establish a formal legal accounting of his deeds, the state was left with fragments, shadows, and an infuriating void where definitive answers should have resided. The recovery of the remains of Hazel Brown and Minnie Gotthard through the reluctant cooperation of Clifford Wheeler provided vital anchors of undeniable truth, transforming whispered tavern rumors into cold, hard forensic facts that could no longer be dismissed. Yet, these discoveries simultaneously highlighted the vast, haunting expanse of the unknown, the dozens of other waitresses, dancers, and companions who vanished into the vacuum of the saloon without leaving behind a trace of their final moments. This permanent gap between suspicion and verification is the true cross that historians and true crime chroniclers must bear, accepting that some secrets are buried too deeply in the sun-baked soil of South Texas ever to be fully illuminated by the light of modern inquiry, leaving us to grapple eternally with the weight of shadows. To deeply understand the environment that permitted such prolonged atrocities, we must continuously return to the harsh socioeconomic realities of the Great Depression. It was an era of intense desperation, where millions of individuals were unmoored from stability, wandering a fractured landscape in search of basic survival and economic refuge. In this climate of widespread vulnerability, working-class women faced insurmountable barriers, often forced to labor in precarious environments like rural saloons where protections were virtually non-existent and societal regard was dangerously low. Joe Ball exploited this structural inequality with chilling precision. He recognized that the cultural prejudices of his era rendered these women largely invisible to the protective apparatus of the state, creating a cushion of plausible deniability that shielded his dark activities from public scrutiny. His ability to maintain an outward facade of calm, unshakable normalcy, while carrying out unthinkable violence behind the scenes underscores a terrifying aspect of criminal psychology that continues to baffle experts. It teaches us that extreme evil does not always announce itself with theatrical malice or grotesque deformations. Instead, it can wear the comfortable, reassuring mask of a smiling local merchant, pouring drinks and exchanging pleasantries while orchestrating unimaginable horrors just out of sight of his patrons. The collective psychology of the small community of Elmendorf during those turbulent years offers a sobering lesson in the corrosive nature of fear and unspoken complicity. When warning signs accumulate, when foul and inexplicable odors drift persistently from a courtyard enclosure, and when neighbors vanish at a statistically impossible rate, a community is faced with a profound moral choice. The decision of the local residents to look the other way, to swallow their mounting suspicions, and to accept the smooth, rehearsed falsehoods offered across the bar counter was driven by the crushing weight of isolation and the pervasive fear of a dominant, unpredictable figure. This phenomenon of collective silence demonstrates how easily social harmony can be weaponized to suppress dissent and normalize the abnormal. It is a timeless reminder that tyranny and cruelty often persist not merely because of the active malice of the wicked, but because of the passive compliance of the good who choose safety over truth. The legacy of the Elmendorf case challenges us to remain eternally vigilant against this subtle erosion of moral courage, urging us to cultivate communities where the vulnerable are fiercely protected, where warning signs are met with active inquiry rather than fearful dismissal, and where no individual is ever permitted to slip silently into the shadows unnoticed by those around them who hold the power to intervene. As we honor the memory of the victims who lost their lives in this dark chapter, our deepest ethical obligation is to ensure their humanity is never overshadowed by the sensationalism of the narrative. History and popular culture have a persistent tendency to gravitate toward the macabre, fixating obsessively on the alligators, the cinematic imagery, and the dramatic finality of the suicide, while allowing the actual people at the center of the tragedy to fade into nameless statistics. But Hazel Brown and Minnie Gotthard were not mere plot points in a grim anthology. They were daughters, sisters, friends, and human beings with profound intrinsic value, complex inner lives, and unwritten futures that were brutally and unjustly stolen from them. By telling their stories with sobriety, respect, and uncompromising historical accuracy, we honor their memory and push back against the tide of oblivion. We reclaim their humanity from the cold mechanics of crime files and ensure that their tragic fates serve as an enduring beacon of remembrance, reminding us of the urgent necessity of empathy, vigilance, and the relentless pursuit of justice for those who cannot speak for themselves. Their voices, though silenced by violence, continue to echo across the decades as a powerful reminder of our collective duty to protect the defenseless from the predatory elements that occasionally lurk behind the ordinary facades of daily life. The natural landscape of South Texas remains an indifferent witness to the human dramas played out upon its dusty expanses. The San Antonio River flows steadily past the silent banks where the shallow graves were once uncovered, paying no heed to the historical traumas inscribed into the soil beside its winding course. Time erodes the physical remnants of the past, turning wooden taverns into dust and replacing the noisy crossroads of a troubled era with the quiet, unassuming pace of modern rural life. Yet, the intellectual and moral lessons of the Joe Ball case remain permanently etched into the consciousness of our collective history, serving as a solemn reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the enduring obligation of society to remember those who were unjustly erased. We leave behind the dusty plains, the murky waters of the courtyard, and the chilling echoes of a terrifying past, carrying with us the profound realization that the defense of human decency requires constant vigilance, unwavering compassion, and an absolute refusal to let the darkness triumph over the light of truth. As the final echoes of this extended exploration fade into the quiet silence of history, we are left with a solemn responsibility to remember, to question, and to protect, ensuring that the forgotten women of Elmendorf are never truly lost to the darkness, but are instead forever illuminated by our enduring commitment to justice, empathy, and remembrance. The story of the Elmendorf butcher is closed, its files archived in the vast library of human history, but the solemn obligation to remain awake, aware, and deeply human remains eternally alive, guiding our steps forward through the uncertain shadows of the world we share. Whispering across the decades a timeless warning about the fragility of our civilization and the eternal duty we owe to one another in an often dark and unforgiving universe where vigilance is our only true safeguard against the abyss. As we stand finally at the ultimate threshold of this extensive and deeply harrowing narrative exploration into the dark heart of American true crime history, we are compelled to look back across the vast expanse of the journey we have undertaken together. The story of Joe Ball and his infamous Elmendorf establishment has carried us through the scorching heat of 1930s Texas, plunging us deep into the turbulent aftermath of Prohibition, the crushing economic despair of the Great Depression, and the claustrophobic social dynamics of a small rural community caught in the quiet grip of unacknowledged terror. We have navigated the smoky rooms of the Sociable Inn, peered into the murky depths of the alligator enclosure, where predatory spectacle masked unspeakable horror, and walked in solemn, reflective silence along the desolate, sun-baked banks of the San Antonio River, where the hidden graves of Hazel Brown and Minnie Gotthard were ultimately unearthed. Yet, even as we arrive at this final concluding movement of our multi-part chronicle, we are intensely aware that the true weight of this history cannot be fully encapsulated by forensic data, legal case files, or historical archives alone. It resides instead within the profound, lingering echoes of human sorrow that continue to reverberate through the collective conscience, reminding us of the heavy toll exacted when a community looks away and a predator operates unchecked in plain sight. The passage of time possesses a unique and relentless power to alter our perception of historical reality, gradually smoothing down the jagged edges of actual trauma until they fit comfortably within the softer contours of folklore and urban legend. For decades, the tale of the Elmendorf butcher has been retold around campfires and across popular culture as a chilling ghost story, a sensationalized narrative featuring a monstrous saloon keeper who fed his victims to captive reptiles. While this dark mythology has undeniably cemented the case within the permanent folklore of the United States, it carries a profound risk that we have continually sought to counter throughout our exploration. That risk is the subtle, unintentional erasure of the real human beings whose lives were brutally cut short, reducing flesh and blood women to mere props in a grand campfire thriller. True historical responsibility demands that we aggressively strip away the sensationalism, look past the cinematic embellishments, and confront the sobering, unvarnished truth of what actually transpired behind the wooden counters and closed doors of the sociable inn. The horror of this case is not rooted in fantastical monsters or mythical beasts, but in the cold, calculated, and thoroughly human capacity for cruelty, manipulation, and the systemic exploitation of the vulnerable. Throughout our deep examination of the socioeconomic conditions that defined South Texas during the interwar years, we have confronted the uncomfortable reality that predators thrive most successfully when society is already predisposed to ignore its most precarious populations. The young women who stepped into the sociable inn as waitresses, dancers, or partners were not looking for tragedy. They were simply trying to survive a punishing economic climate that offered vanishingly few protections or opportunities for working-class individuals. They labored on the absolute margins of societal respectability, an ambiguous social standing that Joe Ball manipulated with chilling, predatory precision. He understood innately that the cultural prejudices of his era rendered these women largely invisible to the protective apparatus of the state, creating a protective shield of plausible deniability that allowed him to make them vanish without triggering immediate alarm. His ability to maintain an unshakable, calm facade while executing unspeakable violence underscores a terrifying aspect of criminal psychology, teaching us that extreme evil does not always wear a terrifying mask or announce itself with obvious malice. Instead, it can comfortably inhabit the mundane routines of civilization, wearing the reassuring face of a smiling local merchant who pours drinks and exchanges pleasantries with customers while orchestrating unimaginable horrors just out of sight. The collective psychology of the small town of Elmendorf during those tense and suffocating years offers a timeless and sobering lesson in the corrosive nature of fear, isolation, and unspoken complicity. When warning signs accumulate year after year, when foul and inexplicable odors drift persistently from a courtyard enclosure, and when young women vanish at a statistically impossible rate, a community is inevitably forced to confront a profound moral choice. The decision of the local residents to look the other way, to swallow their mounting suspicions, and to accept the smooth, rehearsed falsehoods offered across the bar counter was driven by the crushing weight of social isolation and the pervasive fear of a dominant, unpredictable figure. This phenomenon of collective silence demonstrates how easily social harmony and the desire for self-preservation can be weaponized to suppress dissent and normalize the abnormal. It stands as a permanent reminder that tyranny and cruelty often persist not merely because of the active malice of the wicked, but because of the passive compliance of the good who choose safety over truth. The legacy of the Elmendorf case challenges us to remain eternally vigilant against this subtle erosion of moral courage, urging us to cultivate communities where the vulnerable are fiercely protected, where warning signs are met with active inquiry rather than fearful dismissal, and where no individual is ever permitted to slip silently into the shadows unnoticed by those around them who hold the power to intervene. As we honor the memory of the victims who lost their lives in this dark chapter, our deepest and most sacred ethical obligation is to ensure their humanity is never overshadowed by the sensationalism of the narrative. History and popular culture have a persistent, unfortunate tendency to gravitate toward the macabre, fixating obsessively on the alligators, the cinematic imagery, and the dramatic finality of the suicide, while allowing the actual people at the center of the tragedy to fade into nameless statistics. But Hazel Brown and Minnie Gotthard were not mere plot points in a grim anthology. They were daughters, sisters, friends, and human beings with profound intrinsic value, complex inner lives, and unwritten futures that were brutally and unjustly stolen from them. By telling their stories with sobriety, respect, and uncompromising historical accuracy, we honor their memory and push back against the tide of oblivion. We reclaim their humanity from the cold mechanics of crime files and ensure that their tragic fates serve as an enduring beacon of remembrance, reminding us of the urgent necessity of empathy, vigilance, and the relentless pursuit of justice for those who cannot speak for themselves. Their voices, though silenced by violence, continue to echo across the decades as a powerful reminder of our collective duty to protect the defenseless from the predatory elements that occasionally lurk behind the ordinary facades of daily life. The natural landscape of South Texas remains an indifferent witness to the human dramas played out upon its dusty expanses. The San Antonio River flows steadily past the silent banks where the shallow graves were once uncovered, paying no heed to the historical traumas inscribed into the soil beside its winding course. Time erodes the physical remnants of the past, turning wooden taverns into dust and replacing the noisy crossroads of a troubled era with the quiet, unassuming pace of modern rural life. Yet, the intellectual and moral lessons of the Joe Ball case remain permanently etched into the consciousness of our collective history, serving as a solemn reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the enduring obligation of society to remember those who were unjustly erased. We leave behind the dusty plains, the murky waters of the courtyard, and the chilling echoes of a terrifying past, carrying with us the profound realization that the defense of human decency requires constant vigilance, unwavering compassion, and an absolute refusal to let the darkness triumph over the light of truth. As the final echoes of this extended exploration fade into the quiet silence of history, we are left with the solemn responsibility to remember, to question, and to protect, ensuring that the forgotten women of Elmendorf are never truly lost to the darkness, but are instead forever illuminated by our enduring commitment to justice, empathy, and remembrance. The story of the Elmendorf butcher is closed, its files archived in the vast library of human history, but the solemn obligation to remain awake, aware, and deeply human remains eternally alive, guiding our steps forward through the uncertain shadows of the world we share. Whispering across the decades a timeless warning about the fragility of our civilization and the eternal duty we owe to one another in an often dark and unforgiving universe where vigilance is our only true safeguard against the abyss. As we cross the final threshold into this ultimate segment of our exhaustive narrative journey, we find ourselves reflecting upon the profound weight of history and the relentless manner in which time reshapes our understanding of human tragedy. The story of Joe Ball, stretching outward from the dusty crossroads of Elmendorf, Texas, into the wider annals of American true crime, has proven to be far more than a simple recounting of historical violence. It has served as a sprawling, complex examination of a society under stress, the deep vulnerabilities of marginalized lives during the Great Depression, and the chilling capacity of ordinary individuals to mask monstrous acts behind the familiar facades of everyday commerce. Throughout our multi-part exploration, we have painstakingly dismantled the sensational myths and urban legends that accumulated around the sociable in moving past the cinematic drama of the alligator pit and the abrupt, violent finality of the suicide behind the counter, to recenter our focus where it rightfully belongs. That focus remains fixed upon the human cost of the tragedy, upon the real women whose lives were systematically erased by a predator who manipulated the systemic blind spots of his era. In doing so, we have honored a solemn commitment to truth, remembrance, and empathy, ensuring that the shadows of the past are illuminated by a persistent, unyielding light of historical accountability that transcends the ephemeral allure of sensationalism. The physical environment of Elmendorf has undergone profound transformations since those tense and suffocating days of September 1938. The wooden structures that once housed the bustling post-Prohibition saloon have long since decayed, their remnants absorbed by the earth, while the modern world paves over the historical footprints of a darker era. Yet, the psychological geography of the town remains quietly haunted by the echoes of what transpired behind closed doors. Visitors walking along the quiet rural paths today might find little visible evidence of the terror that once gripped the community, but the historical record stands as an enduring monument to human vulnerability and the critical importance of societal vigilance. The lessons embedded within the Joe Ball case reach far beyond the specific confines of rural Texas, offering timeless insights into the mechanics of predatory behavior and the dangerous seduction of collective silence. When communities choose comfort over confrontation, when warning signs are dismissed out of fear, and when vulnerable populations are left unprotected on the margins of society, the conditions that allowed the Elmendorf butcher to operate with virtual impunity are quietly recreated in new forms. It is this universal relevance that ensures the case will continue to be studied by historians, criminologists, and sociologists seeking to understand the fragile boundaries of civilization and the eternal struggle between moral courage and institutional apathy in an interconnected world. At the absolute heart of this extensive chronicle remain the names and memories of those who were unjustly stripped of their futures. Hazel Brown and Minnie Gotthard, whose physical remains were finally recovered from their shallow graves near the desolate banks of the San Antonio River through the reluctant cooperation of Clifford Wheeler, stand as permanent symbols of both the tragedy and the resilience of human truth. While the technological limitations of 1930s forensic science prevented authorities from uncovering the full, exhaustive scope of the missing persons files, and while the mystery of the alligators will forever remain locked in the realm of unprovable folklore, the verified existence of these two women anchors our narrative in undeniable reality. They were not mere statistics or fleeting characters in a dark anthology. They were individuals with hopes, dreams, families, and intrinsic human worth that transcended the precarious nature of their labor. By refusing to let their stories dissolve into the background of sensationalism, we have reclaimed their humanity from the cold mechanics of police dossiers and true crime lore. Their enduring memory serves as a poignant reminder that every victim of violence deserves to be seen, remembered, and mourned with absolute sobriety and respect, shielding their identities from the eroding tides of historical oblivion and ensuring that their voices are never truly silenced by the passage of time. The psychological burden borne by the residents of Elmendorf, who lived through the unfolding nightmare, offers a profound case study in the corrosive nature of unspoken complicity and fear. The choice to look the other way, to rationalize foul odors, and to accept the smooth falsehoods offered across the saloon counter-demonstrates how easily social harmony and self-preservation can suppress moral action. It reminds us that tyranny and cruelty often persist not solely through the active malice of the wicked, but through the quiet, passive compliance of the good who mistake silence for safety. Recognizing this human failing is not an indictment of a single small town, but a universal mirror reflecting our own contemporary vulnerabilities. We are all challenged to cultivate environments of active empathy and unwavering moral courage, where the vulnerable are fiercely protected, where warning signs are met with rigorous inquiry rather than fearful dismissal, and where no individual is ever allowed to slip unnoticed into the shadows of institutional indifference. This active vigilance is our strongest safeguard against the dark forces that occasionally seek to exploit the fractures of our society, reminding us that protecting the defenseless is an ongoing, daily obligation that requires both courage and steadfast compassion in an unpredictable universe. Furthermore, the cultural persistence of the Elmendorf legend highlights how society processes horror through the lens of myth, filtering the raw brutality of serial murder through the safe distance of folklore. While cinematic interpretations and campfire tales have kept the memory of the alligator man alive in the popular imagination, they have frequently done so at the expense of historical fidelity, prioritizing the grotesque spectacle over the quiet dignity of the victims. Our deep dive into the archives has been an intentional counterweight to this tendency, peeling away the layers of cinematic embellishment to reveal the stark, unfiltered mechanics of human exploitation. We have explored how economic desperation creates fertile ground for predators who understand how to weaponize societal indifference, turning the margins of the workforce into a private hunting ground. The realization that Joe Ball was an ordinary man wearing the mask of a friendly merchant rather than a mythic creature makes his crimes all the more chilling, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable truth that malevolence often wears an inviting smile and pours drinks across a polished wooden counter while darkness festers just out of sight in the ordinary light of day. As the decades stretch onward, the landscape of South Texas continues to change, smoothing over the physical wounds of the past with the steady march of progress and nature. Yet, the moral imperative to remember remains entirely unchanged. The San Antonio River continues its slow, indifferent flow past the silent banks where the tragic secrets were once unearthed, indifferent to the human sorrows recorded in its soil, leaving us as the sole custodians of this historical memory. We bear the solemn responsibility of ensuring that the lessons learned from the sociable and are never forgotten, that the warnings of the past serve as a guiding light for our present and future actions. The journey through this dark chapter of true crime history has been arduous and emotionally heavy, demanding an unflinching look at the worst aspects of human nature balanced by an unwavering dedication to empathy and truth. It is a journey that transforms passive listeners into active guardians of memory, challenging us to look beyond the surface of everyday life and recognize that the defense of human dignity is an eternal responsibility that belongs to each and every one of us. As the final echoes of this comprehensive narrative fade into the quiet expanse of history, we are left with a profound sense of closure tempered by an enduring obligation of remembrance. The dusty crossroads, the murky waters, and the chilling echoes of a terrifying era recede into the distance, but the moral imperatives they illuminate remain brightly burning. We leave behind the dark tavern of the sociable inn, carrying forward the solemn realization that our collective humanity is measured by how we treat the most vulnerable among us and how fiercely we defend the truth against the creeping shadows of indifference. The story of Joe Ball is closed, its files archived in the vast library of human experience, but the eternal duty to remain awake, aware, and deeply compassionate remains vibrantly alive. Through our commitment to truth, empathy, and historical remembrance, we ensure that the forgotten women of Elmendorf are never truly lost to the dark, remaining forever illuminated by the enduring light of our shared moral responsibility as we navigate the uncertain pathways of the world we share together. In reflecting upon the totality of this extensive investigation, we recognize that the true power of true crime narrative lies in its capacity to restore humanity to the forgotten and to shine a bright, unyielding light into the darkest recesses of the human condition. By examining every facet of the Elmendorf tragedy with unflinching rigor, deep emotional resonance, and absolute historical accuracy, we have built a lasting monument to those who suffered in silence and whose lives were unjustly stolen. Their stories will forever echo across the quiet plains of Texas, serving as a solemn and permanent reminder to future generations that vigilance, compassion, and an unshakable commitment to truth are our greatest defenses against the abyss of indifference. We close these archives with the profound certainty that memory is a sacred trust, one that we must carry forward with unwavering grace and responsibility.